Welcome to 3 Weeks of Weird. Cool Air by H.P. Lovecraft. You ask me to explain why I am afraid of a draught of cool air, why I shiver more than others upon entering a cold room, and seem nauseated and repelled when the chill of evening creeps through the heat of a mild autumn day. There are those who say I respond to cold as others do to a bad odour, and I am the last to deny the impression. What I will do is to relate the most horrible circumstance I ever encountered, and leave it to you to judge whether or not this forms a suitable explanation of my peculiarity. It is a mistake to fancy that horror is associated inextricably with darkness, silence, and solitude. I found it in the glare of mid-afternoon, in the clangour of a metropolis, and in the teeming midst of a shabby and commonplace rooming-house, with a prosaic landlady and 2 stalwart men by my side. In the spring of 1923, I had secured some dreary and unprofitable magazine work in the city of New York, and being unable to pay any substantial rent, began drifting from one cheap boarding establishment to another in search of a room which might combine the qualities of decent cleanliness, endurable furnishings, and very reasonable price. It soon developed that I had only a choice between different evils, but after a time I came upon a house in West 14th Street, which disgusted me much less than the others I had sampled. The place was a 4-story mansion of brownstone, dating apparently from the late 40s, and fitted with woodwork and marble whose stained and sullied splendour argued a descent from high levels of tasteful opulence. In the rooms, large and lofty, and decorated with impossible paper and ridiculously ornate stucco cornices, there lingered a depressing mustiness and hint of obscure cookery, but the floors were clean, the linen tolerably regular, and the hot water not too often cold or turned off, so that I came to regard it as at least a bearable place to hibernate, till one might really live again. The landlady, a slatternly, almost bearded Spanish woman named Herrero, did not annoy me with gossip or with criticisms of the late-burning electric light in my third-floor front hall room, and my fellow lodgers were as quiet and uncommunicative as one might desire, being mostly Spaniards a little above the coarsest and crudest grade. Only the din of streetcars in the thoroughfare below proved a serious annoyance. I had been there about 3 weeks when the first odd incident occurred. One evening, at about 8, I heard a spattering on the floor and became suddenly aware that I had been smelling the pungent odour of ammonia for some time. Looking about, I saw that the ceiling was wet and dripping, the soaking apparently proceeding from a corner on the side toward the street. Anxious to stop the matter at its source, I hastened to the basement to tell the landlady, and was assured by her that the trouble would quickly be set right.
"Dr. Munoz,"
she cried as she rushed upstairs ahead of me.
"he have spill his chemicals. He is too sick for doctor himself, sicker and sicker all the time, but he will not have no other for help. He is very queer in his sickness. All day he take funny-smelling baths, and he cannot get excited or warm. All his own housework he do. His little room are full of bottles and machines, and he do not work as doctor. But he was great once. My father in Barcelona have heard of him. And only just now he fixed an arm of the plumber that get hurt of sudden. He never go out, only on roof. My boy Esteban, he bring him his food, and laundry and medicines and chemicals. My God, the salamoniac that man used for keep him cool."
Mrs. Herrero disappeared up the staircase to the 4th floor, and I returned to my room. The ammonia ceased to drip, and as I cleaned up what had spilled and opened the window for air, I heard the landlady's heavy footsteps above me. Dr. Munoz I had never heard, save for certain sounds as of some gasoline-driven mechanism, since his step was soft and gentle. I wondered for a moment what the strange affliction of this man might be, and whether his obstinate refusal of outside aid were not the result of a rather baseless eccentricity. There is, I reflected tritely, an infinite deal of pathos in the state of an eminent person who has come down in the world. I might never have known Dr. Munoz had it not been for the heart attack that suddenly seized me one forenoon as I sat writing in my room. Physicians had told me of the danger of those spells, and I knew there was no time to be lost. So, remembering what the landlady had said about the invalid's help of the injured workman, I dragged myself upstairs and knocked feebly at the door above mine. My knock was answered in good English by a curious voice some distance to the right, asking my name and business, and these things being stated, there came an opening of the door next to the one I had sought. A rush of cool air greeted me, and though the day was one of the hottest of late June, I shivered as I crossed the threshold into a large apartment, whose rich and tasteful decoration surprised me in this nest of squalor and seediness. A folding couch now filled its diurnal role of sofa, and the mahogany furniture, sumptuous hangings, old paintings, and mellow bookshelves all bespoke a gentleman's study rather than a boarding-house bedroom. I now saw that the whole room above mine, the little room of bottles and machines which Mrs. Herrero had mentioned, was merely the laboratory of the doctor, and that his main living quarters lay in the spacious adjoining room, whose convenient alcoves and large contiguous bathroom permitted him to hide all dressers and obtrusive utilitarian devices. Dr. Munoz, most certainly, was a man of birth, cultivation, and discrimination. The figure before me was short but exquisitely proportioned, and clad in somewhat formal dress of perfect cut and fit. A high-bred face of masterful, though not arrogant expression was adorned by a short iron-grey full beard, and an old-fashioned pince-nez shielded the full, dark eyes and surmounted an aquiline nose which gave a Moorish touch to a physiognomy otherwise dominantly Celtiberian. Thick, well-trimmed hair that argued the punctual calls of a barber was parted gracefully above a high forehead, and the whole picture was one of striking intelligence and superior blood and breeding. Nevertheless, as I saw Dr. Munoz in that blast of cool air, I felt a repugnance which nothing in his aspect could justify. Only his lividly inclined complexion and coldness of touch could have afforded a physical basis for this feeling, and even these things should have been excusable, considering the man's known invalidism. It might, too, have been the singular cold that alienated me, for such chilliness was abnormal on so hot a day, and the abnormal always excites aversion, distrust, and fear. But repugnance was soon forgotten in admiration, for the strange physician's extreme skill at once became manifest, despite the ice-coldness and shakiness of his bloodless-looking hands. He clearly understood my needs at a glance, and ministered to them with a master's deftness, the while reassuring me in a finely modulated, though oddly hollow and timbreless voice, that he was the bitterest of sworn enemies to death, and had sunk his fortune and lost all his friends in a lifetime of bizarre experiment devoted to its bafflement and extirpation. Something of the benevolent fanatic seemed to reside in him, and he rambled on almost garrulously as he sounded my chest and mixed a suitable draught of drugs fetched from the smaller laboratory room. Evidently, he found the society of a well-born man a rare novelty in this dingy environment, and was moved to unaccustomed speech as memories of better days surged over him. His voice, if queer, was at least soothing, and I could not even perceive that he breathed as the fluent sentences rolled urbanely out. He sought to distract my mind from my own seizure by speaking of his theories and experiments, and I remember his tactfully consoling me about my weak heart by insisting that will and consciousness are stronger than organic life itself, so that if a bodily frame be but originally healthy and carefully preserved, it may, through a scientific enhancement of these qualities, retain a kind of nervous animation, despite the most serious impairments, defects, or even absences in the battery of specific organs. He might, he half-jestingly said, some day teach me to live, or at least to possess some kind of conscious existence, without any heart at all. For his part, he was afflicted with a complication of maladies requiring a very exact regimen, which included constant cold. Any marked rise in temperature might, if prolonged, affect him fatally, and the frigidity of his habitation, some 55 or 56 degrees Fahrenheit, was maintained by an absorption system of ammonia cooling, the gasoline engine of whose pumps I had often heard in my own room below. Relieved of my seizure in a marvellously short while, I left the shivery place a disciple and devotee of the gifted recluse. After that, I paid him frequent overcoated calls, listening while he told of secret researches and almost ghastly results, and trembling a bit when I examined the unconventional and astonishingly ancient volumes on his shelves. I was eventually, I may add, almost cured of my disease for all time by his skilful ministrations. It seems that he did not scorn the incantations of the medievalists, since he believed these cryptic formulae to contain rare psychological stimuli, which might conceivably have singular effects on the substance of a nervous system from which organic pulsations had fled. I was touched by his account of the aged Dr. Torres of Valencia, who had shared his earlier experiments with him through the great illness of 18 years before, whence his present disorders proceeded. No sooner had the venerable practitioner saved his colleague than he himself succumbed to the grim enemy he had fought. Perhaps the strain had been too great, for Dr. Munoz made it whisperingly clear, though not in detail, that the methods of healing had been most extraordinary, involving scenes and processes not welcomed by elderly and conservative Galens. As the weeks passed, I observed with regret that my new friend was indeed slowly but unmistakably losing ground physically, as Mrs. Herrero had suggested. The livid aspect of his countenance was intensified, his voice became more hollow and indistinct, his muscular motions were less perfectly coordinated, and his mind and will displayed less resilience and initiative. Of this sad change he seemed by no means unaware, and little by little his expression and conversation both took on a gruesome irony, which restored in me something of the subtle repulsion I had originally felt. He developed strange caprices, acquiring a fondness for exotic spices and Egyptian incense, till his room smelled like the vault of a sepulchred pharaoh in the Valley of Kings. At the same time, his demands for cold air increased, and with my aid he amplified the ammonia piping of his room, and modified the pumps and feed of his refrigerating machine till he could keep the temperature as low as 34 degrees or 40 degrees, and finally even 28 degrees. The bathroom and laboratory, of course, being less chilled, in order that water might not freeze, and that chemical processes might not be impeded. The tenant adjoining him complained of the icy air from around the connecting door, so I helped him fit heavy hangings to obviate the difficulty. A kind of growing horror, of outre and morbid cast, seemed to possess him. He talked of death incessantly, but laughed hollowly when such things as burial or funeral arrangements were gently suggested. All in all, he became a disconcerting and even gruesome companion, yet in my gratitude for his healing I could not well abandon him to the strangers around him, and was careful to dust his room and attend to his needs each day, muffled in a heavy ulster, which I bought especially for the purpose. I likewise did much of his shopping, and gasped in bafflement at some of the chemicals he ordered from druggists and laboratory supply houses. An increasing and unexplained atmosphere of panic seemed to rise around his apartment. The whole house, as I have said, had a musty odor, but the smell in his room was worse, and in spite of all the spices and incense and the pungent chemicals of the now incessant baths which he insisted on taking unaided, I perceived that it must be connected with his ailment, and shuddered when I reflected on what that ailment might be. Mrs. Herrero crossed herself when she looked at him, and gave him up unreservedly to me, not even letting her son Esteban continue to run errands for him. When I suggested other physicians, the sufferer would fly into as much of a rage as he seemed to dare to entertain. He evidently feared the physical effect of violent emotion, yet his will and driving force waxed rather than waned, and he refused to be confined to his bed. The lassitude of his earlier ill days gave place to a return of his fiery purpose, so that he seemed about to hurl defiance at the death demon, even as that ancient enemy seized him. The pretense of eating, always curiously like a formality with him, he virtually abandoned, and mental power alone appeared to keep him from total collapse. He acquired a habit of writing long documents of some sort, which he carefully sealed and filled with injunctions that I transmit them after his death to certain persons whom he named, for the most part lettered East Indians, but including a once celebrated French physician, now generally thought dead, and about whom the most inconceivable things had been whispered. As it happened, I burned all these papers undelivered and unopened. His aspect and voice became utterly frightful, and his presence almost unbearable. One September day, an unexpected glimpse of him induced an epileptic fit in a man who had come to repair his electric desk lamp, a fit for which he prescribed effectively whilst keeping himself well out of sight. That man, oddly enough, had been through the terrors of the Great War without having incurred any fright so thorough. Then, in the middle of October, the horror of horrors came with stupefying suddenness. One night, about 11, the pump of the refrigerating machine broke down, so that within 3 hours the process of ammonia cooling became impossible. Dr. Munoz summoned me by thumping on the floor, and I worked desperately to repair the injury, while my host cursed in a tone whose lifeless, rattling hollowness surpassed description. My amateur efforts, however, proved of no use, and when I had brought in a mechanic from a neighbouring all-night garage, we learned that nothing could be done till morning, when a new piston would have to be obtained. The moribund hermit's rage and fear, swelling to grotesque proportions, seemed likely to shatter what remained of his failing physique, and once a spasm caused him to clap his hands to his eyes and rush into the bathroom. He groped his way out with face tightly bandaged, and I never saw his eyes again. The frigidity of the apartment was now sensibly diminishing, and at about 5 a.m. the doctor retired to the bathroom, commanding me to keep him supplied with all the ice I could obtain at all-night drugstores and cafeterias. As I would return from my sometimes discouraging trips and lay my spoils before the closed bathroom door, I could hear a restless splashing within, and a thick voice croaking out the order for more. At length, a warm day broke, and the shops opened one by one. I asked Esteban either to help with the ice fetching whilst I obtained the pump piston, or to order the piston while I continued with the ice, but instructed by his mother, he absolutely refused. Finally, I hired a seedy-looking loafer whom I encountered on the corner of 8th Avenue, to keep the patient supplied with ice from a little shop where I introduced him, and applied myself diligently to the task of finding a pump piston and engaging workmen competent to install it. The task seemed interminable, and I raged almost as violently as the hermit when I saw the hours slipping by in a breathless, foodless round of vain telephoning and a hectic quest from place to place, hither and thither, by subway and surface car. About noon, I encountered a suitable supply house far downtown, and at approximately 1:30 p.m. arrived at my boarding place with the necessary paraphernalia and 2 sturdy and intelligent mechanics. I had done all I could, and hoped I was in time. Black terror, however, had preceded me. The house was in utter turmoil, and above the chatter of awed voices, I heard a man praying in a deep basso. Fiendish things were in the air, and lodgers told over the beads of their rosaries as they caught the odour from beneath the doctor's closed door. The lounger I had hired, it seems, had fled screaming and mad-eyed not long after his second delivery of ice, perhaps as a result of excessive curiosity. He could not, of course, have locked the door behind him, yet it was now fastened, presumably from the inside. There was no sound within save a nameless sort of slow, thick dripping. Briefly consulting with Mrs. Herrero and the workmen, despite a fear that gnawed my inmost soul, I advised the breaking down of the door. But the landlady found a way to turn the key from the outside with some wire device. We had previously opened the doors of all the other rooms on that hall, and flung all the windows to the very top. Now, noses protected by handkerchiefs, we tremblingly invaded the accursed south room, which blazed with the warm sun of early afternoon. A kind of dark, slimy trail led from the open bathroom door to the hall door, and thence to the desk, where a terrible little pool had accumulated. Something was scrawled there in pencil in an awful, blind hand on a piece of paper, hideously smeared, as though by the very claws that traced the hurried last words. Then the trail led to the couch, and ended unutterably. What was, or had been, on the couch, I cannot and dare not say here, but this is what I shiveringly puzzled out on the stickily smeared paper before I drew a match and burned it to a crisp, what I puzzled out in terror as the landlady and two mechanics rushed frantically from that hellish place to babble their incoherent stories at the nearest police station. The nauseous words seemed well-nigh incredible in that yellow sunlight, with the clatter of cars and motor trucks ascending clamorously from crowded 14th Street, yet I confess that I believed them then. Whether I believe them now, I honestly do not know. There are things about which it is better not to speculate, and all that I can say is that I hate the smell of ammonia, and grow faint at a draught of unusually cool air. The end, ran that noisome scrawl, is here. No more ice. The man looked and ran away, warmer every minute, and the tissues can't last. I fancy you know what I said about the will and the nerves and the preserved body after the organs ceased to work. It was good theory, but couldn't keep up indefinitely. There was a gradual deterioration I had not foreseen. Dr. Torres knew, but the shock killed him. He couldn't stand what he had to do. He had to get me in a strange, dark place when he minded my letter and nursed me back, and the organs never would work again. It had to be done my way, artificial preservation, for you see, I died that time 18 years ago.
To Howard Phillips Lovecraft by Clark Ashton Smith. Lover of hills and fields and towns antique, how hast thou wandered hence on ways not found before, beyond the dawnward spires of Providence? Hast thou gone forth to seek some older born than these, some Arkham of the prime and central wizardries, or, with familiar Felidae, dost now some new and secret wood explore, a little past the sense's farther wall, where spring and sunset charm the eternal path from earth to ether in dimensions nemeral? Or has the silver key opened perchance for thee wonders and dreams and worlds ulterior? Hast thou gone home to Althar or to Nath? Has the High King who reigns in dim Kadath called back his courtly sage ambassador? Or darkling Cthulhu sent the sign which makes thee now a counselor within that founded fortress of the deep, where the old ones stir in sleep, till mighty Temblors shake their slumbering continent? Lo, in this little interim of days, how far thy feet are sped upon the fabulous and mooted ways where walk the mythic dead. For us the grief, for us the mystery, and yet thou art not gone, nor given wholly unto dream and dust. For even upon this lonely western hill of Averoigne, thy flesh had never visited. I met some wise and sentient wraith of thee, some undeparting presence, gracious and august, more luminous for thee the vernal grass, more magically dark the druid stone, and in the mind thou art forever shown, as in a magic glass, and from the spirit's page thy runes can never pass.
The People of the Pit by Abraham Merritt. North of us, a shaft of light shot halfway to the zenith. It came from behind the 5 peaks. The beam drove up through a column of blue haze, whose edges were marked as sharply as the rain that streams from the edges of a thundercloud. It was like the flash of a searchlight through an azure mist. It cast no shadows. As it struck upward, the summits were outlined hard and black, and I saw that the whole mountain was shaped like a hand. As the light silhouetted it, the gigantic fingers stretched. The hand seemed to thrust itself forward. It was exactly as though it moved to push something back. The shining beam held steady for a moment, then broke into myriads of little luminous globes that swung to and fro and dropped gently. They seemed to be searching. The forest had become very still. Every wood noise held its breath. I felt the dogs pressing against my legs. They too were silent, but every muscle in their bodies trembled. Their hair was stiff along their backs, and their eyes, fixed on the falling lights, were filmed with the terror glaze. I looked at Anderson. He was staring at the north, where once more the beam had pulsed upward. "It can't be the aurora," I spoke, without moving my lips. My mouth was as dry as though Lao Cha had poured his fear dust down my throat. "If it is, I never saw one like it," he answered in the same tone. "Besides, who ever heard of an aurora at this time of the year?" He voiced the thought that was in my own mind. "It makes me think something is being hunted up there," he said. "An unholy sort of hunt. It's well for us to be out of range." "The mountain seems to move each time the shaft shoots up," I said. "What's it keeping back, Star? It makes me think of the frozen hand of cloud that Shah Nador set before the gate of ghouls to keep them in the lairs that Eblis cut for them." He raised a hand, listening. From the north and high overhead there came a whispering. It was not the rustling of the aurora, that rushing, crackling sound like the ghosts of winds that blew at creation racing through the skeleton leaves of ancient trees that sheltered Lilith. It was a whispering that held in it a demand. It was eager. It called us to come where the beam was flashing. It drew. There was in it a note of inexorable insistence. It touched my heart with 1,000 tiny fear-tipped fingers, and it filled me with a vast longing to race on and merge myself in the light. It must have been so that Ulysses felt when he strained at the mast and strove to obey the crystal-sweet singing of the sirens. The whispering grew louder. "What the hell's the matter with those dogs?" cried Anderson savagely. "Look at them!" The Malamutes, whining, were racing away toward the light. We saw them disappear among the trees. There came back to us a mournful howling. Then that too died away, and left nothing but the insistent murmuring overhead. The glade we had camped in looked straight to the north. We had reached, I suppose, 300 mile above the first great bend of the Kuskokwim, toward the Yukon. Certainly, we were in an untrodden part of the wilderness. We had pushed through from Dawson at the breaking of the spring, on a fair lead to the lost 5 peaks between which, so the Athabascan medicine man had told us, the gold streams out like putty from a clenched fist. Not an Indian were we able to get to go with us. The land of the Hand Mountain was accursed, they said. We had sighted the peaks the night before, their tops faintly outlined against a pulsing glow, and now we saw the light that had led us to them. Anderson stiffened. Through the whispering had broken a curious pad-pad and a rustling. It sounded as though a small bear were moving towards us. I threw a pile of wood on the fire and, as it blazed up, saw something break through the bushes. It walked on all fours, but it did not walk like a bear. All at once it flashed upon me. It was like a baby crawling upstairs. The forepaws lifted themselves in grotesquely infantile fashion. It was grotesque, but it was terrible. It grew closer. We reached for our guns and dropped them. Suddenly we knew that this crawling thing was a man. It was a man. Still, with the high-climbing pad-pad, he swayed to the fire. He stopped. "Safe," whispered the crawling man, in a voice that was an echo of the murmur overhead. "Quite safe here. They can't get out of the blue, you know. They can't get you, unless you go to them." He fell over on his side. We ran to him. Anderson knelt. "God's love," he said. "Frank, look at this." He pointed to the hands. The wrists were covered with torn rags of a heavy shirt. The hands themselves were stumps. The fingers had been bent into the palms, and the flesh had been worn to the bone. They looked like the feet of a little black elephant. My eyes traveled down the body. Around the waist was a heavy band of yellow metal. From it fell a ring and a dozen links of shining white chain. "What is he? Where did he come from?" said Anderson. "Look, he's fast asleep, yet even in his sleep his arms try to climb and his feet draw themselves up one after the other. And his knees, how in God's name was he ever able to move on them?" It was even as he said. In the deep sleep that had come upon the crawler, arms and legs kept raising in a deliberate, dreadful climbing motion. It was as though they had a life of their own. They kept their movement independently of the motionless body. They were semaphoric motions. If you have ever stood at the back of a train and had watched the semaphores rise and fall, you will know exactly what I mean. Abruptly, the overhead whisperings ceased. The shaft of light dropped and did not rise again. The crawling man became still. A gentle glow began to grow around us. It was dawn, and the short Alaskan summer night was over. Anderson rubbed his eyes and turned to me a haggard face. "Man," he exclaimed, "you look as though you've been through a spell of sickness." "No more than you, Star," I said. "What do you make of it all?" "I'm thinking our only answer lies there," he answered, pointing to the figure that lay so motionless under the blankets we had thrown over him. "Whatever it was, that's what it was after. There was no aurora about that light, Frank. It was like the flaring up of some queer hell the preacher folk never frightened us with." "We'll go no further today," I said. "I wouldn't wake him for all the gold that runs between the fingers of the 5 Peaks, nor for all the devils that may be behind them." The crawling man lay in a sleep as deep as the Styx. We bathed and bandaged the pads that had been his hands. Arms and legs were as rigid as though they were crutches. He did not move while we worked over him. He lay as he had fallen, the arms a trifle raised, the knees bent. "Why did he crawl?" whispered Anderson. "Why didn't he walk?" I was filing the band about the waist. It was gold, but it was like no gold I had ever handled. Pure gold is soft. This was soft, but it had an unclean, viscid life of its own. It clung to the file. I gashed through it, bent it away from the body, and hurled it far off. It was loathsome. All that day he slept. Darkness came, and still he slept. That night there was no shaft of light, no questing globe, no whispering. Some spell of horror seemed lifted from the land. It was noon when the crawling man awoke. I jumped as the pleasant, drawling voice sounded. "How long have I slept?" he asked. His pale blue eyes grew quizzical as I stared at him. "A night and almost 2 days," I said. "Was there any light up there last night?" He nodded to the north, eagerly. "Any whispering?" "Neither," I answered. His head fell back, and he stared up at the sky. "They've given it up, then?" he said at last. "Who have given it up?" asked Anderson. "Why, the people of the pit," replied the crawling man quietly. We stared at him. "The people of the pit," he said. "Things that the devil made before the flood, and that somehow have escaped God's vengeance. You weren't in any danger from them, unless you had followed their call. They can't get any further than the blue haze. I was their prisoner," he added simply. "They were trying to whisper me back to them." Anderson and I looked at each other, the same thought in both our minds. "You're wrong," said the crawling man. "I'm not insane. Give me a very little to drink. I'm going to die soon, but I want you to take me as far south as you can before I die, and afterwards I want you to build a big fire and burn me. I want to be in such shape that no infernal spell of theirs can drag my body back to them. You'll do it too, when I've told you about them." He hesitated. "I think their chain is off me," he said. "I cut it off," I answered shortly. "Thank God for that too," whispered the crawling man. He drank the brandy and water we lifted to his lips. "Arms and legs quite dead," he said. "Dead as I'll be soon. Well, they did well for me. Now, I'll tell you what's up there behind that hand. Hell! Now listen. My name is Stanton, Sinclair Stanton, class 1900, Yale, explorer. I started away from Dawson last year to hunt for 5 peaks that rise like a hand in a haunted country and run pure gold between them. Same thing you were after? I thought so. Late last fall, my comrade sickened, sent him back with some Indians. Little later, all my Indians ran away from me. I decided I'd stick, built a cabin, stocked myself with food, and lay down to winter it. In the spring, I started off again. Little less than 2 weeks ago, I sighted the 5 Peaks. Not from this side, though. The other. Give me some more brandy. I'd made too wide a detour, he went on. I'd gotten too far north. I beat back. From this side, you see nothing but forest straight up to the base of the Ann Mountain. Over on the other side. He was silent for a moment. Over there is forest too. But it doesn't reach so far. No, I came out of it. Stretching miles in front of me was a level plain. It was as worn and ancient looking as the desert around the ruins of Babylon. At its end rose the peaks. Between me and them, far off, was what looked like a low dike of rocks. Then I ran across the road. "The road?" cried Anderson incredulously. "The road," said the crawling man. "A fine, smooth stone road. It ran straight onto the mountain. Oh, it was road all right, and worn as though millions and millions of feet had passed over it for thousands of years. On each side of it was sand and heaps of stones. After a while, I began to notice these stones. They were cut, and the shape of the heap somehow gave me the idea that 100,000 years ago they might have been houses. I sensed man about them, and at the same time they smelled of immemorial antiquity. Well, the peaks grew closer, the heaps of ruins thicker. Something inexpressibly desolate hovered over them. Something reached from them that struck my heart like the touch of ghosts so old that they could be only the ghosts of ghosts. I went on, and now I saw that what I had thought to be the low rock range at the base of the peaks was a thicker litter of ruins. The Hand Mountain was really much farther off. The road passed between 2 high rocks that raised themselves like a gateway. The crawling man paused. "They were a gateway," he said. "I reached them. I went between them, and then I sprawled and clutched the earth in sheer awe. I was on a broad stone platform. Before me was sheer space. Imagine the Grand Canyon 5 times as wide, and with the bottom dropped out. That is what I was looking into. It was like peeping over the edge of a cleft world, down into the infinity where the planets roll. On the far side stood the 5 Peaks. They looked like a gigantic warning hand stretched up to the sky. The lip of the abyss curved away on each side of me. I could see down perhaps 1,000 feet. Then a thick blue haze shut out the eye. It was like the blue you see gather on the high hills at dusk. And the pit, it was awesome. Awesome as the Maori Gulf of Ranelagh, that sinks between the living and the dead, and that only the freshly released soul has strength to leap, but never strength to cross again. I crept back from the verge and stood up, weak. My hand rested against one of the pillars of the gateway. There was carving upon it. It bore in still sharp outlines the heroic figure of a man. His back was turned. His arms were outstretched. There was an odd peaked headdress upon him. I looked at the opposite pillar. It bore a figure exactly similar. The pillars were triangular, and the carvings were on the side away from the pit. The figures seemed to be holding something back. I looked closer. Behind the outstretched hands, I seemed to see other shapes. I traced them out vaguely. Suddenly I felt unaccountably sick. There had come to me an impression of enormous upright slugs. Their swollen bodies were faintly cut, all except the heads, which were well-marked globes. They were unutterably loathsome. I turned from the gates back to the void. I stretched myself upon the slab and looked over the edge. A stairway led down into the pit. "A stairway?" we cried. "A stairway," repeated the crawling man as patiently as before. It seemed not so much carved out of the rock as built into it. The slabs were about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It ran down from the platform and vanished into the blue haze. "But who could build such a stairway as that?" I said. "A stairway built into the wall of a precipice and leading down into a bottomless pit." "Not bottomless," said the crawling man quietly. "There was a bottom. I reached it." "Reached it?" we repeated. "Yes, by the stairway," answered the crawling man. "You see, I went down it." "Yes," he said. "I went down the stairway, but not that day. I made my camp back of the gates. At dawn I filled my knapsack with food, my 2 canteens with water from a spring that wells up there by the gateway, walked between the carved monoliths, and stepped over the edge of the pit. The steps ran along the side of the rock at a 40-degree pitch. As I went down and down, I studied them. They were of a greenish rock, quite different from the granitic porphyry that formed the wall of the precipice. At first, I thought that the builders had taken advantage of an outcropping stratum and had carved from it their gigantic flight. But the regularity of the angle at which it fell made me doubtful of this theory. After I had gone perhaps half a mile, I stepped out upon a landing. From this landing, the stairs made a V-shaped turn and ran on downward, clinging to the cliff at the same angle as the first flight. It was a zigzag, and after I had made 3 of these turns, I knew that the steps dropped straight down in a succession of such angles. No strata could be so regular as that. No, the stairway was built by hands. But whose? The answer is in those ruins around the edge, I think, never to be read. By noon, I had lost sight of the 5 peaks and the lip of the abyss. Above me, below me, was nothing but the blue haze. Beside me, too, was nothingness, for the further breast of rock had long since vanished. I felt no dizziness, and any trace of fear was swallowed in a vast curiosity. What was I to discover? Some ancient and wonderful civilization that had ruled when the poles were tropical gardens? Nothing living, I felt sure. All was too old for life. Still, a stairway so wonderful must lead to something quite as wonderful, I knew. What was it? I went on. At regular intervals I had passed the mouths of small caves. There would be 2,000 steps, and then an opening, 2,000 more steps, and an opening, and so on and on. Late that afternoon, I stopped before one of these clefts. I suppose I had gone then 3 miles down the pit, although the angles were such that I had walked in all fully 10 miles. I examined the entrance. On each side were carved the figures of the great portal above, only now they were standing face forward, the arms outstretched as though to hold something back from the outer depths. Their faces were covered with veils. There were no hideous shapes behind them. I went inside. The fissure ran back for 20 yards like a burrow. It was dry and perfectly light. Outside, I could see the blue haze rising upward like a column, its edges clearly marked. I felt an extraordinary sense of security, although I had not been conscious of any fear. I felt that the figures at the entrance were guardians. But against what? The blue haze thickened and grew faintly luminescent. I fancied that it was dusk above. I ate and drank a little and slept. When I awoke, the blue had lightened again, and I fancied it was dawn above. I went on. I forgot the gulf yawning at my side. I felt no fatigue and little hunger or thirst, although I had drunk and eaten sparingly. That night I spent within another of the caves, and at dawn I descended again. It was late that day when I first saw the city. He was silent for a time. "The city," he said at last. "There is a city, you know, but not such a city as you have ever seen, nor any other man who has lived to tell of it. The pit, I think, is shaped like a bottle. The opening before the 5 peaks is the neck, but how wide the bottom is, I do not know. Thousands of miles, maybe. I had begun to catch little glints of light far down in the blue. Then I saw the tops of trees, I suppose they are, but not our kind of trees. Unpleasant, snaky kind of trees. They reared themselves on high thin trunks, and their tops were nests of thick tendrils with ugly little leaves like arrowheads. The trees were red, a vivid, angry red. Here and there, I glimpsed spots of shining yellow. I knew these were water, because I could see things breaking through their surface, or at least I could see the splash and ripple, but what it was that disturbed them, I never saw. Straight beneath me was the city. I looked down upon mile after mile of closely packed cylinders. They lay upon their sides in pyramids of 3, of 5, of dozens, piled upon each other. It is hard to make you see what that city is like. Look, suppose you have water pipes of a certain length, and first you lay 3 of them side by side, and on top of them you place 2, and on these 2, 1. Or suppose you take 5 for a foundation, and place on these 4, and then 3, then 2, and then 1. Do you see? That was the way they looked. But they were topped by towers, by minarets, by flares by fans and twisted monstrosities. They gleamed as though coated with pale rose flame. Beside them, the venomous red trees raised themselves like the heads of hydras guarding nests of gigantic, jeweled and sleeping worms. A few feet beneath me, the stairway jutted out into a titanic arch, unearthly as the span that bridges hell and leads to Asgard. It curved out and down straight through the top of the highest pile of carven cylinders, and then it vanished through it. It was appalling. It was demonic. The crawling man stopped. His eyes rolled up into his head. He trembled, and his arms and legs began their horrible crawling movement. From his lips came a whispering. It was an echo of the high murmuring we had heard the night he came to us. I put my hands over his eyes. He quieted. "The things are cursed," he said. "The people of the pit," did I whisper. "Yes, but they can't get me now. They can't." After a time, he began as quietly as before. I crossed the span. I went down through the top of that building. Blue darkness shrouded me for a moment, and I felt the steps twist into a spiral. I wound down, and then I was standing high up in... I can't tell you in what. I'll have to call it a room. We have no images for what is in the pit. 100 feet below me was the floor. The walls sloped down and out from where I stood in a series of widening crescents. The place was colossal, and it was filled with a curious mottled red light. It was like the light inside a green and gold flecked fire opal. I went down to the last step. Far in front of me rose a high, columned altar. Its pillars were carved in monstrous scrolls, like mad octopuses with 1,000 drunken tentacles. They rested on the backs of shapeless monstrosities carved in crimson stone. The altar front was a gigantic slab of purple covered with carvings. I can't describe these carvings. No human being could. The human eye cannot grasp them any more than it can grasp the shapes that haunt the fourth dimension. Only a subtle sense in the back of the brain sensed them vaguely. They were formless things that gave no conscious image, yet pressed into the mind like small hot seals, ideas of hate, of combats between unthinkable monstrous things, victories in a nebulous hell of steaming, obscene jungles, aspirations and ideals immeasurably loathsome. And as I stood, I grew aware of something that lay behind the lip of the altar, 50 feet above me. I knew it was there. I felt it with every hair and every tiny bit of my skin. Something infinitely malignant, infinitely horrible, infinitely ancient. It lurked, it brooded, it threatened, and it was invisible. Behind me was a circle of blue light. I ran for it. Something urged me to turn back, to climb the stairs and make away. It was impossible. Repulsion for that unseen thing raced me onward, as though a current had my feet. I passed through the circle. I was out on a street that stretched on into dim distance between rows of the carven cylinders. Here and there the red trees arose. Between them rolled the stone burrows, and now I could take in the amazing ornamentation that clothed them. They were like the trunks of smooth-skinned trees that had fallen and had been clothed with high-reaching, noxious orchids. Yes, those cylinders were like that, and more. They should have gone out with the dinosaurs. They were monstrous. They struck the eyes like a blow, and they passed across the nerves like a rasp, and nowhere was the sight or sound of living thing. There were circular openings in the cylinders, like the circle in the temple of the stairway. I passed through one of them. I was in a long, bare-vaulted room whose curving sides half closed 20 feet over my head, leaving a wide slit that opened into another vaulted chamber above. There was absolutely nothing in the room, save the same mottled, reddish light that I had seen in the temple. I stumbled. I still could see nothing, but there was something on the floor over which I had tripped. I reached down, and my hand touched a thing cold and smooth that moved under it. I turned and ran out of that place. I was filled with a loathing that had in it something of madness. I ran on and on blindly, wringing my hands, weeping with horror. When I came to myself, I was still among the stone cylinders and red trees. I tried to retrace my steps, to find the temple. I was more than afraid. I was like a new loose soul, panic-stricken with the first terrors of hell. I could not find the temple. Then the haze began to thicken and glow, the cylinders to shine more brightly. I knew that it was dusk in the world above, and I felt that with dusk my time of peril had come, that the thickening of the haze was the signal for the awakening of whatever things lived in this pit. I scrambled up the sides of one of the burrows. I hid behind a twisted nightmare of stone. Perhaps, I thought, there was a chance of remaining hidden until the blue lightened and the peril passed. There began to grow around me a murmur. It was everywhere, and it grew and grew into a great whispering. I peeped from the side of the stone down into the street. I saw lights passing and repassing, more and more lights. They swam out of the circular doorways and they thronged the street. The highest were 8 feet above the pave, the lowest perhaps 2. They hurried, they sauntered, they bowed, they stopped and whispered, and there was nothing under them.
Nothing under them?
Breathed Anderson. No, he went on. That was the terrible part of it. There was nothing under them, yet certainly the lights were living things. They had consciousness, volition, thought. What else I did not know. They were nearly 2 feet across, the largest. The center was a bright nucleus, red, blue, green. This nucleus faded off gradually into a misty glow that did not end abruptly. It too seemed to fade off into nothingness, but a nothingness that had under it a somethingness. I strained my eyes trying to grasp this body into which the lights merged and which one could only feel was there, but could not see. And all at once I grew rigid, something cold and thin like a whip that touched my face. I turned my head. Close behind were 3 of the lights. They were a pale blue. They looked at me, if you can imagine lights that are eyes. Another whiplash gripped my shoulder. Under the closest light came a shrill whispering. I shrieked. Abruptly, the murmuring in the street ceased. I dragged my eyes from the pale blue globe that held them and looked out. The lights in the streets were rising by myriads to the level of where I stood. There they stopped and peered at me. They crowded and jostled as though they were a crowd of curious people on Broadway. I felt a score of the lashes touch me. When I came to myself, I was again in the great place of the stairway, lying at the foot of the altar. All was silent. There were no lights, only the mottled red glow. I jumped to my feet and ran toward the steps. Something jerked me back to my knees, and then I saw that around my waist had been fastened a yellow ring of metal. From it hung a chain, and this chain passed up over the lip of the high ledge. I was chained to the altar. I reached into my pockets for my knife to cut through the ring. It was not there. I had been stripped of everything, except one of the canteens that I had hung around my neck, which I suppose they had thought was part of me. I tried to break the ring. It seemed alive. It writhed in my hands and it drew itself closer around me. I pulled at the chain. It was immovable. There came to me the consciousness of the unseen thing above the altar. I grovelled at the foot of the slab and wept. Think, alone in that place of strange light with the brooding ancient horror above me, a monstrous thing, a thing unthinkable, an unseen thing that poured forth horror. After a while, I gripped myself. Then I saw beside one of the pillars a yellow bowl filled with a thick white liquid. I drank it. If it killed, I did not care, but its taste was pleasant, and as I drank, my strength came back to me with a rush. Clearly, I was not to be starved. The lights, whatever they were, had a conception of human needs. And now, the reddish mottled gleam began to deepen. Outside arose the humming, and through the circle that was the entrance came streaming the globes. They ranged themselves in ranks until they filled the temple. Their whispering grew into a chant, a cadenced whispering chant that rose and fell, while to its rhythm the globes lifted and sank. All that night the lights came and went, and all that night the chant sounded as they rose and fell. At the last, I felt myself only an atom of consciousness in a sea of cadenced whispering, an atom that rose and fell with the bowing globes. I tell you that even my heart pulsed in unison with them. The red glow faded, the light streamed out, the whispering died. I was again alone, and I knew that once again day had broken in my own world. I slept, When I awoke, I found beside the pillar more of the white liquid. I scrutinized the chain that held me to the altar. I began to rub two of the links together. I did this for hours. When the red began to thicken, there was a ridge worn in the links. Hope rushed up within me. There was, then, a chance to escape. With the thickening, the lights came again. All through that night, the whispering chant sounded, and the globes rose and fell. The chant seized me. It pulsed through me until every nerve and muscle quivered to it. My lips began to quiver. They strove like a man trying to cry out on a nightmare. And at last they, too, were whispering the chant of the people of the pit. My body bowed in unison with the lights. I was, in movement and sound, one with the nameless things, while my soul sank back sick with horror and powerless. While I whispered, I saw them. Saw the lights? I asked stupidly. Saw the things under the lights, he answered. Great, transparent, snail-like bodies, dozens of waving tentacles stretching from them, round gaping mouths under the luminous seeing globes. They were like the ghosts of inconceivably monstrous slugs. I could see through them, and as I stirred, still bowing and whispering, the dawn came, and they streamed to and through the entrance. They did not crawl or walk. They floated. They floated and were gone. I did not sleep. I worked all that day at my chain. By the thickening of the red, I had worn it a sixth through. And all that night I whispered and bowed with the pit people, joining in their chant to the thing that brooded above me. Twice again the red thickened and the chant held me. Then on the morning of the fifth day, I broke through the worn links of the chain. I was free. I drank from the bowl of white liquid and poured what was left in my flask. I ran to the stairway. I rushed up and past that unseen horror behind the altar ledge and was out upon the bridge. I raced across the span and up the stairway. Can you think what it is to climb straight up the verge of a cleft world with hell behind you? Hell was behind me, and terror rode me. The city had long been lost in the blue haze before I knew that I could climb no more. My heart beat upon my ears like a sledge. I fell before one of the little caves, feeling that here at last was sanctuary. I crept far back within it and waited for the haze to thicken. Almost at once it did so. From far below me came a vast and angry murmur. At the mouth of the rift, I saw a light pulse up through the blue, die down, and as it dimmed, I saw myriads of the globes that are the eyes of the pit people swing downward into the abyss. Again and again the light pulsed and the globes fell. They were hunting me. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. There grew in me the dreadful desire to join in the whispering, as I had done in the temple. I bit my lips through and through to still them. All that night the beam shot up through the abyss, the globes swung and the whispering sounded, and now I knew the purpose of the caves and of the sculptured figures that still had power to guard them. But what were the people who had carved them? Why had they built their city around the verge, and why had they set that stairway in the pit? What had they been to those things that dwelt at the bottom, and what use had the things been to them that they should live beside their dwelling place? That there had been some purpose was certain. No work so prodigious as the stairway would have been undertaken otherwise. But what was the purpose? And why was it that those who had dwelt about the abyss had passed away, ages gone, and the dwellers in the abyss still lived? I could find no answer, nor can I find any now. I have not the shred of a theory. Dawn came as I wondered, and with it, silence. I drank what was left of the liquid in my canteen, crept from the cave, and began to climb again. That afternoon, my legs gave out. I tore off my shirt, made from it pads for my knees and coverings for my hands. I crawled upward. I crawled up, and again I crept into one of the caves and waited until again the blue thickened. The shaft of light shot through it, and the whispering came. But now there was a new note in the whispering. It was no longer threatening. It called and coaxed. It drew. A new terror gripped me. There had come upon me a mighty desire to leave the cave and go out where the light swung, to let them do with me as they pleased, carry me where they wished. The desire grew. It gained fresh impulse with every rise of the beam, until at last I vibrated with the desire, as I had vibrated to the chant in the temple. My body was a pendulum. Up would go the beam, and I would swing toward it. Only my soul kept steady. It held me fast to the floor of the cave, and all that night it fought with my body against the spell of the pit people. Dawn came. Again I crept from the cave and faced the stairway. I could not rise. My hands were torn and bleeding, my knees in agony. I forced myself upward step by step. After a while my hands became numb. The pain left my knees. It deadened. Step by step, my will drove my body upward upon them. And then, a nightmare of crawling up infinite stretches of steps, memories of dull horror while hidden within caves with the lights pulsing without and whisperings that called and called me. Memory of a time when I awoke to find that my body was obeying the call and had carried me halfway out between the guardians of the portals while thousands of gleaming globes rested in the blue haze and watched me. Glimpses of bitter fights against sleep and always, a climb up and up along infinite distances of steps that led from Abaddon to a paradise of blue sky and open world. At last, a consciousness of the clear sky close above me, the lip of the pit before me, memory of passing between the great portals of the pit and of steady withdrawal from it, dreams of giant men with strange peaked crowns and veiled faces who pushed me onward and held back Roman candle globules of light that sought to draw me back to a gulf wherein planets swam between the branches of red trees that had snakes for crowns. And then a long, long sleep. How long, God alone knows, in a cleft of rocks, an awakening to see far in the north, the beam still rising and falling, the light still hunting, the whispering high above me, calling, again crawling on dead arms and legs that moved like the ancient mariner's ship, without volition of mine, but that carried me from a haunted place. And then your fire, and this safety. The crawling man smiled at us for a moment, then swiftly life faded from his face. He slept. That afternoon, we struck camp and, carrying the crawling man, started back south. For 3 days we carried him, and still he slept. And on the third day, still sleeping, he died. We built a great pile of wood, and we burned his body as he had asked. We scattered his ashes about the forest with the ashes of the trees that had consumed him. It must be a great magic indeed that could disentangle those ashes and draw him back in a rushing cloud to the pit he called accursed. I do not think that even the people of the pit have such a spell. No. But we did not return to the 5 Peaks to see. The Vanishing of Simmons by August Derleth. There is perhaps nothing so spiritually disturbing in this life as a sudden reversal of natural laws which for generations have guided mankind. Nor, in my opinion, can anything have a more permanent effect upon an individual's emotional life than the occurrence of an incident which leaves him no alternative but to believe that there are secret and terrible loopholes in our natural laws, loopholes which mercifully are seldom discovered, but which nevertheless manifest themselves at long intervals. The shock resulting from such a discovery may well make it impossible for the individual experiencing it ever to readjust himself, and yet sometimes readjustment is possible. There is, for instance, the case of John Simmons, his strange and inexplicable vanishing some years ago, an incident upon which what I have set down below will possibly throw some light. My acquaintance with John Simmons began in our university days. He had struck me from the first as a quiet but very intense young man, an impression speedily confirmed, and our casual relations soon brought us into closer friendship. As a result, we kept up a desultory correspondence for some time after our college years, and when I finally decided to take up the practice of medicine in his home city of Richmond, he was pleased beyond words. Simmons had changed little from his college days. If anything, he had become more intense. He was at work as an efficiency expert, and I understood that his services were much in demand. But though Simmons had changed little, there was one interest in his life for which I was unable to account. He had taken up the study of the occult and black magic, and was applying himself to it with all his peculiar intensity. It was not until later that I learned from our mutual friend, Colonel Manson, that Simmons had originally begun dabbling in the occult merely as an escape from the precision of his daily work, but that his casual interest had been given a powerful impetus by something that had happened on the former Simmons estate just beyond Richmond. Since, I have come to believe that the incident Colonel Manson had reference to had a powerful bearing on the mystery of Simmons's disappearance, a belief in which I am supported by Colonel Manson. I think that the incident should be chronicled here, so that the various and sometimes confusing incidents culminating in the disappearance may be brought forward as they occurred. A young mulatto woman, in the employ of Major Simmons, John's father, was suspected by the old man of being a mamaloi in a local voodoo cult. Since the Major was a man of strong will, he undertook to punish the woman for her connections with the cult. The mother of the girl, who also worked for the Major, tried to interfere and got several canings for her efforts. John Simmons got mixed up in the quarrel between the Negroes and his father. How, it was never made clear, but as a result, both the Simmons were anathema to the Negro population of Richmond. The mulatto woman and her mother left Major Simmons's employ and disappeared. Not long after, Major Simmons died suddenly of a heart attack, and certain odd features of his death, among them the fact that the Major had never had trouble with his heart, had led John to believe that there was something more behind his father's sudden death. He had even started an investigation, but it came to nothing. A few weeks after his father's burial, John Simmons, who had moved into Richmond and sold the estate, was visited by the mother of the mulatto woman, who had been suspected of being a voodoo mamaloi. She was apparently in very poor circumstances, and was selling rather strange pictures, evidently made from photographs, and so closely resembling snapshots that it was difficult to distinguish any difference. Simmons bought one, and though the old woman did not at first want to take anything from him, she did at last accept a few dollars for the picture. The picture was a curious thing, and it played as important a part in our strange adventure as Simmons himself did, a more important part, if that were possible. It was the picture of a slim negress bending over something on the ground. Now, the odd thing about the picture was that though it looked just like a snapshot, it was nevertheless impossible to make out what the woman was holding in her hand, or what she was bending over. The girl had her back to the camera, and it was impossible to see her face, and she was dressed in a rather outlandish fashion. Simmons put the picture up just above his desk, where he could see it all the time. I noticed it the first time I came to see him at his home, and was struck by it at once. However, I did not ask him about it until I had seen him look at it thoughtfully several times in the course of the evening. When I did ask, he had little to say about it. "That's a curious costume she's wearing," I said finally. "Costume of a voodoo priestess," he said shortly. He was obviously loath to talk about the picture, but he continued to stare at it, as if hypnotized. I was about to interrupt his reverie when he spoke again. "You know, Sexton, I'd like that woman to turn around so that I could see what she looks like." "Why?" I asked. "Because I think it's Jenny," he said quickly in a low voice. The intensity of his voice aroused my professional alarm. I stepped over to him and turned him around, and at once the expression on his face changed. "Who is Jenny?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment, bewildered, and it dawned upon me abruptly and rather unpleasantly that he was honestly unaware of having mentioned the name. Then he made a vague motion with his hands as if dismissing the subject and said, "Someone you don't know, Sexton." When I saw Colonel Manson some days later, I spoke to him about the incident, and found, to my surprise, that he took Simmons's fascination for the picture very seriously indeed. "Jenny," he said, "was the name of that young mulatto woman." "Then that accounts for his wish to see the girl turned about," I suggested. "Partly, yes," he replied. "But I think that was only a start for something that has now become much more serious. I believe Simmons's casual desire has turned into an obsession of the worst kind. I've been wanting to speak to you about it before, but I've never known how to begin. You give me the opportunity. I hope that you will be able to do something to drive this obsession out of him. You can believe me when I tell you that I know from good sources that his work suffers because of it." I deprecated his seriousness from force of habit. "Don't think I exaggerate, Sexton," he said. "Watch him yourself, and you will soon see how his obsession might easily interfere with his work." Neither of us said any more about it at the time, but I took to watching Simmons, and it struck me very unpleasantly that Colonel Manson had been perfectly right in what he said. Simmons's obsession was rapidly advancing upon abnormal states, and at the same time his interest in the occult quickened, and once or twice he actually intimated so strongly as to astonish me at his belief in the possibility of black magic in practice. At last it impressed me that the cause of the obsession was a sort of self-hypnosis aided by the picture that had first aroused his curiosity, and I determined to suggest that he destroy the picture and watch what might happen. But something prevented. Early one morning, in the midst of a terrific thunderstorm, I heard my office bell ring, and immediately after, a furious pounding on my door. I got up at once, and in spite of the driving rain, stuck my head out of the window and looked down. It was Simmons. His face was ghastly white. His hair was dishevelled. He wore no coat, and was soaked to the skin. "For God's sake, come down, Sexton," he called. Naturally, I lost no time in doing so. He staggered in and sank exhausted into a chair, but he was up again in a minute, clutching me by the lapels of my dressing gown. There was an alarmingly wild look in his eyes. He was trying to quiet himself, but was not succeeding very well. "Sexton, I'm going mad," he said. Naturally, I was shocked. I had no idea what could be the matter, but saw that the best thing for me to do would be to quiet him down. But I no sooner began to speak than he interrupted me. "You remember the picture, Sexton?" "Yes," I replied, though the picture did not come at once to mind, despite the thinking I had done about it during the preceding weeks. "Well, either I am clean gone, or the woman has turned about. It is Jenny, but my God, her face—" "Come, man, brace up," I said. It was all that I could say. I began to think that Simmons's habit of staring at the picture had at last turned his mind, or that some suggestion on his own part had planted a face in the picture. "The woman has turned about, Sexton," he repeated. I urged him to tell me about it, and gave him a little whiskey to help steady him. He did quiet down, and presently he told me all about it. It seemed simple. He had been working most of the night, and every time he leaned back to rest, his eyes fell upon the picture. Naturally, I thought that here was a typical case of autosuggestion, because finally he saw the face of a woman there, a face he had half expected might have been there, on the original figure, that is. But what I could not explain was, why should the face be as contorted as Simmons made out it was? It had obviously given him quite a turn. I finally promised to go back to his rooms with him and look at the picture myself, to convince him that he had hypnotized himself into seeing something that didn't exist. I went, and he showed me the picture. From that moment on, everything that happened was incredible, for the woman's head was turned so that I could see her face, and that face was the most unutterably horrible parody on a woman's face that I have ever seen. No words can describe it. It embodied the essence of all cosmic horror. It was the height of the awful. I shut my eyes at once, and only Simmons's quavering question opened them again. I kept my head carefully averted from the thing, and had no difficulty in persuading Simmons to let me take the picture along. I left him finally, and at home I looked the picture over more carefully, conquering my repugnance in a measure. It was a mulatto woman, as Simmons had said. The horror that was her face grew upon me minute by minute, until it crystallized in colossal cosmic hate staring from the picture. Before putting the thing away, I wanted to burn it, but something prevented, a strange feeling of powerlessness. I went over to Colonel Manson's, late as it was, to see whether he, too, would verify what I saw in the picture. As he will assure anyone who desires to ask him about it, he saw precisely what I did that night. When I finally put the thing away, I was physically ill and worn down from just looking at it, feeling the power that emanated from that grotesque face, and I have never ceased regretting that I did not then throw the accursed thing into the fire. As it was, I waited until too late. That was the day before Simmons disappeared. On the next day, I was called to his rooms. He was ill. At first, I could find nothing wrong with him, could get nothing much out of him. I made a complete physical examination and located the trouble at once. A dark bruise on the left breast, just above the heart. His skin had gone quite blue and looked devilish bad. I asked him where he had hurt himself like that. He swore up and down that he hadn't bruised himself, and was able to show pretty well that he had not been out of bed since I had gone away with the picture. Naturally, I was perplexed, because the spot was so obviously a bruise, certainly was not something from beneath his skin, as Simmons once suggested. In consequence, I treated it for a bruise. In an hour I was called back again, and was glad to find Colonel Manson there. Simmons was much worse, and the wound on his breast had opened. It was a clean opening, like a knife thrust, but it went pretty deep. To say that I was astonished is putting it as mildly as possible for me. This wound was something entirely unprecedented in all my medical experience, and I have since found no precedent for it in any medical volume of case histories, nor have I ever known anyone who had heard of the like of it before. At first, I thought it might be something working out of his body from inside, but I had to dismiss that idea at once, for the opening in the skin was patently made from outside. Then someone must have done it, but this, when I suggested it to Simmons, he denied with scorn. Finally, he said, "I'm afraid you can do nothing, Sexton. I'm going as my father went." He spoke bitterly. "Nonsense," I shot back. "I'm going to pull you through this or stop practicing." But I didn't feel as certain as my words might have sounded, and he knew it. Then Simmons began to talk. He spoke to no one in particular. It was as if he were speaking his thoughts. "No use. They hate us. I knew there was something strange about Dad's death, and now mine. They hate us for what we did to them. The mulatto woman and her mother. It's that hellish picture, voodoo. I should have known, but I defied them. Now, too late." There was nothing for either Colonel Manson or me to do or say. I thought he was rambling. At least I made myself believe that. I treated the wound as well as I knew how, and left him, promising to return within an hour. It was a little more than an hour later when Colonel Manson and I returned to his rooms. When we got there, he was gone. He was not seen alive again. I say alive, because I now know that he was seen. But he was dead then, and Colonel Manson and I who saw him knew then. It was approximately 10 hours after his disappearance. The Colonel and I had been doing everything within our power to spread the news of Simmons's disappearance, and had been trying to help the local police in their fruitless search for him. We had come back to my home for liquor when I thought of the hellish picture that had caused the trouble. I had stuck it away somewhere the night before, and I had forgotten where I'd put it. But I found it after an hour or so. Neither Colonel Manson nor I had to look at the thing for more than a moment to see that it had changed again, but this time the change was far more frightening. At first, it was impossible to make out what the mulatto woman held in her hand. Now, that came clear as could be. It was a long, thin knife, and it was stained with blood. And in the background, where before there had been only darkness, there were now deep shadows, seemingly alive, negroes and negresses in a horrible ritual dance. But the greatest and most horrible change was in the thing over which the Mamaloi, for she now looked like nothing so much as a triumphant voodoo priestess after the sacrifice, was bending. It came clear as anything else on that ghastly picture. The body of a white man, and his breast was red with blood, where the sacrificial knife had pierced his heart. That man, the sacrifice to the voodoo ceremony, was John Simmons. In some ghastly manner, he had been transported bodily into the picture. It had been a devilish plot against Simmons's life from the beginning. Manson was the first to realize the truth. He came to his feet, his face gray with horror. He was right. he whispered hoarsely. He knew. Then he snatched the picture from my trembling hands and flung it into the open fireplace, where a fire had fortunately been kept burning. The picture burned quickly and easily, but its burning was accompanied by sounds which no fireplace ever emitted before or since. There was first a long-drawn-out sigh of relief. Was it John Simmons's phantom voice? We never knew. Then came, as if from far away, a series of shrill feminine screams, and dinning in the background was the relentless drumming of countless spectral drums. Since then, both Colonel Manson and I have admitted that perhaps, I say perhaps, these strange manifestations were merely products of our horrified minds. This is, both of us freely admit, possible, but I do not think so. I do not think so because there exists an additional shred of evidence. If anyone wishes to look it up, he can do so by checking back in the files of the Richmond Journal. In the issue of May 17th, 1925, on page 7, you will find a short account which may give him pause. It tells of the finding of the bodies of 2 colored women in an isolated hut near the swamps far to the south. The women were identified as Essie Murdoch and her daughter, Jenny, formerly in the employ of Major Simmons of Richmond. Both bodies were horribly and inexplicably burned, and though they were found burned to death in their tiny hut, no article of furniture, except a small tripod upon which it was thought some magic voodoo emblems had been kept, and a partly destroyed photograph of Jenny Murdoch in the costume of a mamaloi, had been touched by fire, nor did the walls of the house show any evidence of either smoke or fire. From Beyond, by H.P. Lovecraft. Horrible beyond conception was the change which had taken place in my best friend, Crawford Tillinghast. I had not seen him since that day, 2 months and a half before, when he had told me toward what goal his physical and metaphysical researches were leading, when he had answered my awed and almost frightened remonstrances by driving me from his laboratory and his house in a burst of fanatical rage. I had known that he now remained mostly shut in the attic laboratory with that accursed electrical machine, eating little and excluding even the servants, but I had not thought that a brief period of 10 weeks could so alter and disfigure any human creature. It is not pleasant to see a stout man suddenly grown thin, and it is even worse when the baggy skin becomes yellowed or greyed, the eyes sunken, circled, and uncannily glowing, the forehead veined and corrugated, and the hands tremulous and twitching. And if added to this there be a repellent unkemptness, a wild disorder of dress, a bushiness of dark hair white at the roots, and an unchecked growth of pure white beard on a face once clean-shaven, the cumulative effect is quite shocking. But such was the aspect of Crawford Tillinghast on the night his half-coherent message brought me to his door after my weeks of exile, such the spectre that trembled as it admitted me, candle in hand, and glanced furtively over its shoulder as if fearful of unseen things in the ancient, lonely house set back from Benevolent Street. That Crawford Tillinghast should ever have studied science and philosophy was a mistake. These things should be left to the frigid and impersonal investigator, for they offer 2 equally tragic alternatives to the man of feeling and action: despair if he fail in his quest, and terrors unutterable and unimaginable if he succeed. Tillinghast had once been the prey of failure, solitary and melancholy, but now I knew, with nauseating fears of my own, that he was the prey of success. I had indeed warned him 10 weeks before, when he burst forth with his tale of what he felt himself about to discover. He had been flushed and excited then, talking in a high and unnatural, though always pedantic voice. "What do we know," he had said, "of the world and the universe about us? Our means of receiving impressions are absurdly few, and our notions of surrounding objects infinitely narrow. We see things only as we are constructed to see them, and can gain no idea of their absolute nature. With 5 feeble senses we pretend to comprehend the boundlessly complex cosmos, yet other beings with a wider, stronger, or different range of senses might not only see very differently the things we see, but might see and study whole worlds of matter, energy, and life which lie close at hand, yet can never be detected with the senses we have. I have always believed that such strange, inaccessible worlds exist at our very elbows, and now I believe I have found a way to break down the barriers. I am not joking. Within 24 hours, that machine near the table will generate waves acting on unrecognized sense organs that exist in us as atrophied or rudimentary vestiges. Those waves will open up to us many vistas unknown to men, and several unknown to anything we consider organic life. We shall see that at which dogs howl in the dark, and that at which cats prick up their ears after midnight. We shall see these things, and other things which no breathing creature has yet seen. We shall overleap time, space, and dimensions, and without bodily motion, peer to the bottom of creation. When Tillinghast said these things, I remonstrated, for I knew him well enough to be frightened rather than amused. But he was a fanatic, and drove me from the house. Now he was no less a fanatic, but his desire to speak had conquered his resentment, and he had written me imperatively in a hand I could scarcely recognize. As I entered the abode of the friend so suddenly metamorphosed to a shivering gargoyle, I became infected with the terror which seemed stalking in all the shadows. The words and beliefs expressed 10 weeks before seemed bodied forth in the darkness beyond the small circle of candlelight, and I sickened at the hollow, altered voice of my host. I wished the servants were about, and did not like it when he said they had all left 3 days previously. It seemed strange that old Gregory, at least, should desert his master without telling as tried a friend as I. It was he who had given me all the information I had of Tillinghast, after I was repulsed in rage. Yet I soon subordinated all my fears to my growing curiosity and fascination. Just what Crawford Tillinghast now wished of me, I could only guess, but that he had some stupendous secret or discovery to impart, I could not doubt. Before, I had protested at his unnatural pryings into the unthinkable. Now that he had evidently succeeded to some degree, I almost shared his spirit, terrible though the cost of victory appeared. Up through the dark emptiness of the house, I followed the bobbing candle in the hand of this shaking parody on man. The electricity seemed to be turned off, and when I asked my guide, he said it was for a definite reason. "It would be too much. I would not dare," he continued to mutter. I especially noted his new habit of muttering, for it was not like him to talk to himself. We entered the laboratory in the attic, and I observed that detestable electrical machine, glowing with a sickly, sinister, violet luminosity. It was connected with a powerful chemical battery, but seemed to be receiving no current, for I recalled that in its experimental stage it had sputtered and purred when in action. In reply to my question, Tillinghast mumbled that this permanent glow was not electrical in any sense that I could understand. He now seated me near the machine, so that it was on my right, and turned a switch somewhere below the crowning cluster of glass bulbs. The usual sputtering began, turned to a whine, and terminated in a drone so soft as to suggest a return to silence. Meanwhile, the luminosity increased, waned again, and assumed a pale outre colour, or blend of colours, which I could neither place nor describe. Tillinghast had been watching me, and noted my puzzled expression. "Do you know what it is?" he whispered. "That is ultraviolet." He chuckled oddly at my surprise. "You thought ultraviolet was invisible, and so it is, but you can see that, and many other invisible things now. Listen to me. The waves from that thing are waking 1,000 sleeping senses in us, senses which we inherit from eons of evolution, from the state of detached electrons to the state of organic humanity. I have seen truth, and I intend to shew it to you. Do you wonder how it will seem? I will tell you." Here Tillinghast seated himself directly opposite me, blowing out his candle and staring hideously into my eyes. "Your existing sense organs, ears first, I think, will pick up many of the impressions, for they are closely connected with the dormant organs. Then there will be others. You have heard of the pineal gland? I laugh at the shallow endocrinologist, fellow dupe and fellow parvenu of the Freudian. That gland is the great sense organ of organs, I have found out. It is like sight in the end, and transmits visual pictures to the brain. If you are normal, that is the way you ought to get most of it. I mean get most of the evidence from beyond. I looked about the immense attic room with the sloping south wall, dimly lit by rays which the everyday eye cannot see. The far corners were all shadows, and the whole place took on a hazy unreality which obscured its nature and invited the imagination to symbolism and phantasm. During the interval that Tillinghast was silent, I fancied myself in some vast and incredible temple of long-dead gods, some vague edifice of innumerable black stone columns reaching up from a floor of damp slabs to a cloudy height beyond the range of my vision. The picture was very vivid for a while, but gradually gave way to a more horrible conception, that of utter, absolute solitude in infinite, sightless, soundless space. There seemed to be a void, and nothing more, and I felt a childish fear which prompted me to draw from my hip pocket the revolver I always carried after dark, since the night I was held up in East Providence. Then, from the farthermost regions of remoteness, the sound softly glided into existence. It was infinitely faint, subtly vibrant, and unmistakably musical, but held a quality of surpassing wildness which made its impact feel like a delicate torture of my whole body. I felt sensations like those one feels when accidentally scratching ground glass. Simultaneously, there developed something like a cold draught, which apparently swept past me from the direction of the distant sound. As I waited breathlessly, I perceived that both sound and wind were increasing, the effect being to give me an odd notion of myself as tied to a pair of rails in the path of a gigantic, approaching locomotive. I began to speak to Tillinghast, and as I did so, all the unusual impressions abruptly vanished. I saw only the man, the glowing machine, and the dim apartment. Tillinghast was grinning repulsively at the revolver which I had almost unconsciously drawn, but from his expression I was sure he had seen and heard as much as I, if not a great deal more. I whispered what I had experienced, and he bade me to remain as quiet and receptive as possible. "Don't move," he cautioned, "for in these rays we are able to be seen as well as to see. I told you the servants left, but I didn't tell you how. It was that thick-witted housekeeper. She turned on the lights downstairs after I had warned her not to, and the wires picked up sympathetic vibrations. It must have been frightful. I could hear the screams up here, in spite of all I was seeing and hearing from another direction, and later it was rather awful to find those empty heaps of clothes around the house. Mrs. Updike's clothes were close to the front hall switch. That's how I know she did it. It got them all. But so long as we don't move, we're fairly safe. Remember, we're dealing with a hideous world in which we are practically helpless. Keep still." The combined shock of the revelation and of the abrupt command gave me a kind of paralysis, and in my terror my mind again opened to the impressions coming from what Tillinghast called beyond. I was now in a vortex of sound and motion, with confused pictures before my eyes. I saw the blurred outlines of the room, but from some point in space there seemed to be pouring a seething column of unrecognizable shapes or clouds, penetrating the solid roof at a point ahead and to the right of me. Then I glimpsed the temple-like effect again, but this time the pillars reached up into an aerial ocean of light, which sent down one blinding beam along the path of the cloudy column I had seen before. After that, the scene was almost wholly kaleidoscopic, and in the jumble of sights, sounds, and unidentified sense impressions, I felt that I was about to dissolve or in some way lose the solid form. One definite flash I shall always remember. I seemed for an instant to behold a patch of strange night sky filled with shining, revolving spheres, and as it receded, I saw that the glowing suns formed a constellation or galaxy of settled shape, this shape being the distorted face of Crawford Tillinghast. At another time, I felt the huge animate things brushing past me, and occasionally walking or drifting through my supposedly solid body, and thought I saw Tillinghast look at them, as though his better-trained senses could catch them visually. I recalled what he had said of the pineal gland, and wondered what he saw with this preternatural eye. Suddenly, I myself became possessed of a kind of augmented sight. Over and above the luminous and shadowy chaos arose a picture which, though vague, held the elements of consistency and permanence. It was indeed somewhat familiar, for the unusual part was superimposed upon the usual terrestrial scene, much as a cinema view may be thrown upon the painted curtain of a theatre. I saw the attic laboratory, the electrical machine, and the unsightly form of Tillinghast opposite me. But of all the space unoccupied by familiar material objects, not one particle was vacant. Indescribable shapes, both alive and otherwise, were mixed in disgusting disarray, and close to every known thing were whole worlds of alien, unknown entities. It likewise seemed that all the known things entered into the composition of other unknown things, and vice versa. Foremost among the living objects were great inky, jellyish monstrosities, which flabbily quivered in harmony with the vibrations from the machine. They were present in loathsome profusion, and I saw to my horror that they overlapped, that they were semi-fluid and capable of passing through one another and through what we know as solids. These things were never still, but seemed ever floating about with some malignant purpose. Sometimes they appeared to devour one another, the attacker launching itself at its victim and instantaneously obliterating the latter from sight. Shudderingly, I felt that I knew what had obliterated the unfortunate servants, and could not exclude the things from my mind, as I strove to observe other properties of the newly visible world that lies unseen around us. But Tillinghast had been watching me, and was speaking. "You see them? You see them? You see the things that float and flop about you and through you every moment of your life? You see the creatures that form what men call the pure air and the blue sky? Have I not succeeded in breaking down the barrier? Have I not shewn you worlds that no other living men have seen?" I heard him scream through the horrible chaos, and looked at the wild face thrust so offensively close to mine. His eyes were pits of flame, and they glared at me with what I now saw was overwhelming hatred. The machine droned detestably. "You think those floundering things wiped out the servants? Fool! They are harmless. But the servants are gone, aren't they? You tried to stop me. You discouraged me when I needed every drop of encouragement I could get. You were afraid of the cosmic truth, you damned coward. But now I've got you. What swept up the servants? What made them scream so loud? Don't know, eh? You'll know soon enough. Look at me. Listen to what I say. Do you suppose there are really any such things as time and magnitude? Do you fancy there are such things as form or matter? I tell you, I have struck depths that your little brain can't picture. I have seen beyond the bounds of infinity, and drawn down demons from the stars. I have harnessed the shadows that stride from world to sow death and madness. Space belongs to me. Do you hear? Things are hunting me now, the things that devour and dissolve. But I know how to elude them. It is you they will get, as they got the servants. Stirring, dear sir? I told you it was dangerous to move. I have saved you so far by telling you to keep still. Saved you to see more sights and to listen to me. If you had moved, they would have been at you long ago. Don't worry. They won't hurt you. They didn't hurt the servants. It was seeing that made the poor devils scream so. My pets are not pretty. They come out of places where aesthetic standards are very different. Disintegration is quite painless, I assure you. But I want you to see them. I almost saw them, but I knew how to stop. You're not curious? I always knew you were no scientist. Trembling, eh? Trembling with anxiety to see the ultimate things I've discovered? Why don't you move, then? Tired? Well, don't worry, my friend, for they are coming. Look! Look! Curse you, look! It's just over your left shoulder. What remains to be told is very brief, and may be familiar to you from the newspaper accounts. The police heard a shot in the old Tillinghast house, and found us there. Tillinghast dead, and me unconscious. They arrested me because the revolver was in my hand, but released me in 3 hours, after they found it was apoplexy which had finished Tillinghast, and saw that my shot had been directed at the noxious machine, which now lay hopelessly shattered on the laboratory floor. I did not tell very much of what I had seen, for I feared the coroner would be sceptical, but from the evasive outline I did give, the doctor told me that I had undoubtedly been hypnotized by the vindictive and homicidal madman. I wish I could believe that, doctor. It would help my shaky nerves if I could dismiss what I now have to think of the air and the sky about and above me. I never feel alone or comfortable, and a hideous sense of pursuit sometimes comes chillingly on me when I am weary. What prevents me from believing the doctor is this one simple fact, that the police never found the bodies of those servants whom they say Crawford Tillinghast murdered.
The Last of Mrs. DeBrugh by H. Sivia. "Letty," Mr. DeBrugh remarked between long puffs on his meerschaum, "you've been a fine maid. You've served Mrs. DeBrugh and me for most of 15 years. Now I haven't much more time in this life, and I want you to know that after Mrs. DeBrugh and I are gone, you will be well taken care of." Letty stopped her dusting of the chairs in Mr. DeBrugh's oak-panelled study. She sighed and turned toward the man, who sat on a heavy sofa, puffing on his pipe and gazing across the room into nothingness. "You mustn't talk that way, Mr. DeBrugh," she said. "You know you're a long time from the dark ways yet." She paused, and then went on dusting and talking again. "And me? Huh! I've only done what any ordinary human would do to such a kind employer as you, sir, especially after all you've done for me." He didn't say anything, and she went on with her work. Of course she liked to work for him. She had adored the kindly old man since first she had met him in an agency 15 years before. A person couldn't ask for a better master. But there was the mistress, Mrs. DeBrugh. It was she who gave Letty cause for worry. What with her nagging tongue and her sharp rebukes, it was a wonder Letty had not quit long before. She would have quit too, but there had been the terrible sickness she had undergone and conquered with the aid of the ablest physicians Mr. DeBrugh could engage. She couldn't quit after that, no matter what misery Mrs. DeBrugh heaped on her, and so she went about her work at all hours, never tiring, always striving to please. She left the study, closing the great door silently behind her, for old Mr. DeBrugh had sunk deeper into the sofa, into the realms of peaceful sleep, and she did not wish to disturb him. "Letty!" came the shrill cry of Mrs. DeBrugh from down the hall. "Get these pictures and take them to the attic at once, and tell Mr. DeBrugh to come here." Letty went for the pictures. "Mr. DeBrugh is asleep," she said, explaining why she was not obeying the last command. "Well, I'll soon fix that, lazy old man. Sleeps all day with that smelly pipe between his teeth. If he had an ounce of pep about him, he'd get out and work the flowers. Sleeps too much anyway. Not good for him." She stamped out of the room and down the hall, and Letty heard her open the door of the study and scream at her husband. "Hector DeBrugh, wake up!" There was a silence, during which Letty wondered what was going on. Then she heard the noisy clop-clop of Mrs. DeBrugh's slippers on the hardwood floor of the study, and she knew the woman was going to shake the daylights out of Mr. DeBrugh and frighten him into wakefulness. She could even imagine she heard Mrs. DeBrugh grasp the lapels of her husband's coat and shake him back and forth against the chair. Then she heard the scream. It came quite abruptly from Mrs. DeBrugh in the study, and it frightened Letty out of her wits momentarily. After that, there was the thud of a falling body and the clatter of an upset piece of furniture. Letty hurried out of the room into the hall and through the open door of the study. She saw Mrs. DeBrugh slumped on the floor in a faint, and beside her an upset ashtray. But her eyes did not linger on the woman, nor the tray. Instead, they focused on the still form of Mr. DeBrugh in the sofa. He was slumped down, his head twisted to one side, and his mouth hanging open from the shaking Mrs. DeBrugh had given him. The meerschaum had slipped from between his teeth, and the cold ashes were scattered on his trousers. Even then, before the sea of tears began to flow from her eyes, Letty knew the old man was dead. She knew what he had meant by the speech he had said to her only a few minutes before. "His heart," was the comment of the doctor, who arrived a short time later and pronounced the old man dead. "He had to go, today, tomorrow, soon." After that, he put Mrs. DeBrugh to bed and turned to Letty. "Mrs. DeBrugh is merely suffering from a slight shock. There is nothing more that I can do. When she awakens, see that she stays in bed for the rest of the day." He left then, and Letty felt a strange coldness about the place, something that had not been there while Mr. DeBrugh was alive. She went downstairs and made several telephone calls, which she knew would be necessary. Later, when Mrs. DeBrugh was feeling better, other arrangements could be made. She straightened the furniture in the study, pushing the familiar sofa back in place from where Mr. DeBrugh invariably moved it. Then she knocked the ashes from the meerschaum, wiped it off, and placed it carefully in the little glass cabinet on the wall where he always kept it. Times would be different now, she knew. She remembered what he had said. "You will be well taken care of." But there had been something else. "After Mrs. DeBrugh and I are gone." Letty could no longer hold back the tears. She fell into a chair, and they poured forth. But time always passes, and with it goes a healing balm for most all sorrows. First, there was the funeral. Then came other arrangements. And there was the will, which Mrs. DeBrugh never mentioned. His things would have fallen into decay, but for the hands of Letty. Always her dustcloth made his study immaculate. Always the sofa was in place, and the pipe clean and shining in the cabinet. There was a different hardness about Mrs. DeBrugh. No longer was she content with driving Letty like a slave day in and day out. She became even more unbearable. There were little things, like taking away her privilege of having Saturday afternoons off, and the occasional forgetting of Letty's weekly pay. Once, Letty thought of leaving during the night, of packing her few clothes and going forever from the house, but that was foolish. There was no place to go, and she was getting too old for maid service. Besides, hadn't Mr. DeBrugh said she would be taken care of? "After Mrs. DeBrugh and I are gone." Perhaps she would not live much longer. And then one morning, Mrs. DeBrugh called Letty in to talk with her. It was the hour Letty had been awaiting and dreading. There was a harsh, gloating tone in Mrs. DeBrugh's voice as she spoke. She was the master now. There was no Hector to think of. "Letty," she said, "for some time now I've been considering closing the house. I'm lonely here. I intend to go to the city and live with my sister. So, you see, I shan't be needing you any longer. I'll be leaving within the next 2 days. I'm sorry." Letty was speechless. She had expected something terrible, but not this. This wasn't so. Mrs. DeBrugh was lying. It was the will she was afraid of. Letty remembered Mr. DeBrugh's promise. She did not complain, however. Her only words were, "I'll leave tomorrow." That night, she packed her things. She had no definite plans, but she hoped something would turn up. Sleep would not come easy, so Letty lay in bed and thought of old Mr. DeBrugh. She imagined he was before her in the room, reclining on the sofa, puffing long on the meerschaum. She even saw in fancy the curling wisps of grey smoke drifting upward, upward. It was sleep. Then, with a start, she was suddenly wide awake. She had surely heard a scream, but no. And then, as soft and as silent as the night wind, came the whisper, "Letty." It drifted slowly off into silence, and a cool breeze crossed her brow. She suddenly felt wet with perspiration. She listened closely, but the whisper was not repeated. Then, noiselessly, she got out of bed, stepped into slippers, and drew a robe about her. Just as silently, she left her room and walked down the hall to Mrs. DeBrugh's bedroom. She rapped softly on the door, fearing the wrath of the woman within at being awakened in the middle of the night. There was no answer, no sound from inside the room. Letty hesitated, wondering what to do, and once more she felt that cool, death-like breeze and heard the faintest of whispers, fainter even than the sighing of the night wind. "Letty." She opened the door and switched on the light. Mrs. DeBrugh lay in the bed as in sleep. but Letty knew, as she had known about Mr. DeBrugh, that it was more than sleep. She quickly called the doctor, and sometime much later he arrived, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. "Dead," he remarked, after looking at the body. "Probably had a shock, fright, nightmare, or something her heart couldn't stand. I always thought she would have died first." Letty walked slowly from the room, down the stairs, still in her robe and slippers. The doctor followed and passed her, going through the door into the outside. She walked, as though directed by some unseen force, into Mr. DeBrugh's study. She switched on a lamp beside the sofa on which he had always sat, and she noticed that it was moved slightly out of place. There was something else about the room, some memory of old days. First, she saw some sort of legal document on the table and wondered at its being there. The title said, "Last Will and Testament of Hector A. DeBrugh." It was brief. She read it through and found that Mr. DeBrugh had spoken truthfully in his promise to her. Beside the will on the table was another object, and she knew then what the something else in the room was. The meerschaum. It lay there beside the document, and a thin spiral of greyish smoke rose upward from it toward the ceiling. No longer did Letty wonder about anything.
Return to the Sabbath by Robert Bloch. 1. It's not the kind of story that the columnists like to print. It's not the yarn press agents love to tell. When I was still in the public relations department at the studio, they wouldn't let me break it. I knew better than to try, for no paper would print such a tale. We publicity men must present Hollywood as a gay place, a world of glamour and stardust. We capture only the light, but underneath the light, there must always be shadows. I've always known that. It's been my job to gloss over those shadows for years, but the events of which I speak form a disturbing pattern too strange to be withheld. The shadow of these incidents is not human. It's been the cursed weight of the whole affair that has proved my own mental undoing. That's why I resigned from the studio post, I guess. I wanted to forget, if I could. And now I know that the only way to relieve my mind is to tell the story. I must break the yarn, come what may. Then perhaps I can forget Carl Jawler's eyes. The affair dates back to one September evening, almost 3 years ago. Les Kincaid and I were slamming down on Main Street in Los Angeles that night. Les is an assistant producer up at the studio, and there was some purpose in his visit. He was looking for authentic types to fill minor roles in a gangster film he was doing. Les was peculiar that way. He preferred the real article rather than the casting bureau's ready-made imitations. We'd been wandering around for some time, as I recall, past the great stone chows that guard the narrow alleys of Chinatown, over through the tourist trap that is Olvera Street, and back along the flop houses of Lower Main. We walked by the cheap burlesque houses, eyeing the insolent Filipinos that sauntered past, and jostling our way through the usual Saturday night slumming parties. We were both rather weary of it all. That's why, I suppose, the dingy little theatre appealed to us. "Let's go in and sit down for a while," Les suggested. "I'm tired." Even a Main Street burlesque show has seats in it, and I felt ready for a nap. The calipagy of the stage attraction did not appeal to me, but I acceded to the suggestion and purchased our tickets. We entered, sat down, suffered through 2 striptease dances, an incredibly ancient blackout sketch, and a grand finale. Then, as is the custom in such places, the stage darkened and the screen flickered into life. We got ready for our doze then. The pictures shown in these houses are usually ancient specimens of the quickie variety, fillers provided to clear the house. As the first blaring notes of the soundtrack heralded the title of the opus, I closed my eyes, slouched lower in my seat, and mentally beckoned to Morpheus. I was jerked back to reality by a sharp dig in the ribs. Les was nudging me and whispering. "Look at this," he murmured, prodding my reluctant body into wakefulness. ever see anything like it?" I glanced up at the screen. What I expected to find, I do not know, but I saw horror. There was a country graveyard, shadowed by ancient trees through which flickered rays of mildewed moonlight. It was an old graveyard, with rotting headstones set in grotesque angles as they leered up at the midnight sky. The camera cut down on one grave, a fresh one. The music on the soundtrack grew louder in cursed climax, but I forgot camera and film as I watched. That grave was reality, hideous reality. The grave was moving. The earth beside the headstone was heaving and churning, as though it were being dug out, not from above, but from below. It quaked upward ever so slowly, terribly. Little clods fell. The sod pulsed out in a steady stream, and little rills of earth kept falling in the moonlight, as though there was something clawing the dirt away, something clawing from beneath. That something, it would soon appear, and I began to be afraid. I didn't want to see what it was. The clawing from below was not natural. It held a purpose not altogether human. Yet I had to look. I had to see it emerge. The sod cascaded in a mound, and then I was staring at the edge of the grave, looking down at the black hole that gaped like a corpse mouth in the moonlight. Something was coming out. Something slithered through that fissure, fumbled at the side of the opening. It clutched the ground above the grave, and in the baleful beams of that demon's moon, I knew it to be a human hand, a thin, white human hand that held but half its flesh, the hand of a lich, a skeleton claw. A second talon gripped the other side of the excavation top, and now, slowly, insidiously, arms emerged, naked, fleshless arms. They crawled across the earth sides like leprous white serpents, the arms of a cadaver, a rising cadaver. It was pulling itself up, and as it emerged, a cloud fell across the moon path. The light faded to shadows as the bulky head and shoulders came into view. One could see nothing, and one was thankful. But the cloud was falling away from the moon now. In a second the face would be revealed, the face of the thing from the grave, the resurrected visage of that which should be rotted in death. What would it be? The shadows fell back. A figure rose out of the grave, and the face turned toward me. I looked and saw... Well, you've been to horror pictures. You know what one usually sees. The ape man, or the maniac, or the death's head. The papier-mâché grotesquerie of the makeup artist. The skull of the dead. I saw none of that. Instead, there was horror. It was the face of a child, I thought, at first. No, not a child, but a man with a child's soul. The face of a poet, perhaps, unwrinkled and calm. Long hair framed a high forehead, crescent eyebrows tilted over closed lids. The nose and mouth were thin and finely chiseled. Over the entire countenance was written an unearthly peace. It was as though the man were in a sleep of somnambulism or catalepsy. And then the face grew larger, the moonlight brighter, and I saw more. The sharper light disclosed tiny touches of evil. The thin lips were fretted, maggot-kissed. The nose had crumbled at the nostrils. The forehead was flaked with putrefaction, and the dark hair was dead, encrusted with slime. There were shadows in the bony ridges beneath the closed eyes. Even now, the skeletal arms were up, and bony fingers brushed at those dead pits as the rotted lids fluttered apart. The eyes opened. They were wide, staring, flaming, and in them was the grave. They were eyes that had closed in death and opened in the coffin under earth. They were eyes that had seen the body rot and the soul depart to mingle in worm-raven darkness below. They were eyes that held an alien life, a life so dreadful as to animate the cadaver's body and force it to claw its way back to outer earth. They were hungry eyes, triumphant now, as they gazed in graveyard moonlight on a world they had never known before. They hungered for the world as only death can hunger for life, and they blazed out of the corpse's pallid face in icy joy. Then the cadaver began to walk. It lurched between the graves, lumbered before ancient tombs. It shambled through the forest night until it reached a road. Then it turned up that road slowly, slowly, and the hunger in those eyes flamed again as the lights of a city flared below. Death was preparing to mingle with men. 2. I sat through all this entranced. Only a few minutes had elapsed, but I felt as though uncounted ages had passed unheeded. The film went on. Les and I didn't exchange a word, but we watched. The plot was rather routine after that. The dead man was a scientist, whose wife had been stolen from him by a young doctor. The doctor had tended him in his last illness and unwittingly administered a powerful narcotic with cataleptic effects. The dialogue was foreign, and I could not place it. All of the actors were unfamiliar to me, and the setting and photography was quite unusual, unorthodox treatment as in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and other psychological films. There was one scene where the living dead man became enthroned as archpriest at a black mass ceremonial, and there was a little child, his eyes as he plunged the knife. He kept decaying throughout the film. The black mass worshippers knew him as an emissary of Satan, and they kidnapped the wife as sacrifice for his own resurrection. The scene with the hysterical woman when she saw and recognized her husband for the first time, and the deep, evil whispering voice in which he revealed his secret to her. The final pursuit of the devil worshippers to the great altar stone in the mountains. The death of the resurrected one. Almost a skeleton, in fact now, riddled by bullets and shot from the weapons of the doctor and his neighbors, the dead one crumbled and fell from his seat on the altar stone. And as those eyes glazed in second death, the deep voice boomed out in a prayer to Sathanas. The lich crawled across the ground to the ritual fire, drew painfully erect, and tottered into the flames. And as it stood, weaving for a moment in the blaze, the lips moved again in infernal prayer, and the eyes implored not the skies, but the earth. The ground opened in a final flash of fire, and the charred corpse fell through. The master claimed his own. It was grotesque, almost a fairy tale in its triteness. When the film had flickered off and the orchestra blared the opening for the next flesh show, we rose in our seats, conscious once more of our surroundings. The rest of the mongrel audience seemed to be in a stupor almost equal to our own. Wide-eyed Japanese sat staring in the darkness. Filipinos muttered covertly to one another. Even the drunken laborers seemed incapable of greeting the grand opening with their usual ribald hoots. Trite and grotesque the plot of the film may have been, but the actor who played the lead had instilled it with ghastly reality. He had been dead. His eyes knew, and the voice was the voice of Lazarus awakened. Les and I had no need to exchange words. We both felt it. I followed him silently as he went up the stairs to the manager's office. Edward Relch was glowering over the desk. He showed no pleasure at seeing us barge in. When Les asked him where he had procured the film for this evening and what its name was, he opened his mouth and emitted a cascade of curses. We learned that Return to the Sabbath had been sent over by a cheap agency from out Inglewood way, that a Western had been expected, and the damned foreign junk substituted by mistake. A hell of a picture this was for a girl show. Gave the audience the lousy creeps, and it wasn't even in English. Stinking imported films. It was some time before we managed to extract the name of the agency from the manager's profane lips, but 5 minutes after that, Les Kincaid was on the phone speaking to the head of the agency. An hour later, we were out at the office. The next morning, Kincaid went in to see the big boss, and the following day, I was told to announce for publication that Karl Joller, the Austrian horror star, had been signed by cable to our studio, and he was leaving at once for the United States. 3. It was a stroke of genius on Kincaid's part. We all felt that way about the matter. Horror pictures were on the way in. Karloff and Lugosi were turning out their early numbers over at Universal and grossing big. Lionel Atwill was doing his usual villainy on several lots, and profitably so. Peter Lorre, the peer of them all, had just been signed for American films after his sensational performances as the psychopathic murderer in M, and his gruesome spy portrayal in The Man Who Knew Too Much. And we knew that Carl Jawler topped them all. If the fans were really sincere in their liking for the macabre, they were going to get the genuine article. Not since Lon Chaney had I seen such consummate artistry. Certainly this man was Chaney's superior in that he had a sincerity which outdistanced the horror of mere make-up tricks. I printed these items, gave all the build-up I could, but after the initial announcements, I was stopped dead. Everything could happen too swiftly. We knew nothing about this man Jawler, really. Subsequent cables to Austrian and German studios failed to disclose any information about the fellow's private life. He had evidently never played in any film prior to return to the Sabbath. He was utterly unknown. The film had never been shown greatly abroad, and it was only by mistake that the Inglewood agency has obtained a copy and run it here in the United States. Audience reaction could not be learned, and the film was not scheduled for general release unless English titles could be dubbed in. I was up a stump. Here we had the find of the year, and I couldn't get enough material out to make it known. We expected Carl Jawler to arrive in 2 weeks, however. I was told to get to work on him as soon as he got in, and flood the news agencies with stories. 3 of our best writers were working on a special production for him already. The big boss meant to handle it himself. It would be similar to the foreign film, for that return from the dead sequence must be included. Jawler arrived on October 7th. He put up at a hotel. The studio sent down its usual welcoming committee, took him out to the lot for formal testing, then turned him over to me. I met the men for the first time in the little dressing room they had assigned him. I'll never forget that afternoon of our first meeting, or my first sight of him as I entered the door. What I expected to see, I don't know, but what I did see amazed me. For Carl Jawler was the dead-alive man of the screen in life. The features were not fretted, of course, but he was tall, and almost as cadaverously thin as in his role. His face was pallid, and his eyes blue-circled, and the eyes were the dead eyes of the movie, the deep, knowing eyes. The booming voice greeted me in hesitant English. Jawler smiled with his lips at my obvious discomfiture, but the expression of the eyes never varied in their alien strangeness. Somewhat hesitantly, I explained my office and my errand. "No publicity," Jawler intoned. "I do not wish to make known what is affairs of mine own doing." I gave him the usual arguments. How much he understood, I cannot say, but he was adamant. I learned only a little, that he had been born in Prague, lived in wealth until the upheavals of the European Depression, and entered film work only to please a director friend of his. This director had made the picture in which Jawler played, for private showings only. By mischance, a print had been released and copied for general circulation. It had all been a mistake. However, the American film offer had come opportunely, since Jawler wanted to leave Austria at once. "After the film appear, I am in bad lights with my friends," he explained slowly. "They do not wish it to be shown, that ceremony." "The Black Mass?" I asked. "Your friends?" "Yes, the worship of Lucifer. It was real, you know." Was he joking? No, I couldn't doubt the man's sincerity. There was no room for mirth in those alien eyes. And then I knew what he meant, what he so casually revealed. He had been a devil worshipper himself, he and that director. They had made the film and meant it for private display in their own occult circles. No wonder he sought escape abroad. It was incredible, save that I knew Europe and the dark northern mind. The worship of evil continues today in Budapest, Prague, Berlin, and he, Carl Jawler, the horror actor, admitted to being one of them. What a story, I thought, and then I realized that it could, of course, never be printed. A horror star admitting belief in the parts he played? Absurd! All the features about Boris Karloff played up the fact that he was a gentleman who found true peace in raising a garden. Lugosi was pictured as a sensible neurotic, tortured by the roles he played in the films. Atwill was a socialite and a stage star. and Peter Lorre was always written up as being gentle as a lamb, a quiet student whose ambition was to play comedy parts. No, it would never do to break the story of Jorla's devil worship, and he was so damnably reticent about his private affairs. I sought out Kincaid after the termination of our unsatisfactory interview. I told him what I had encountered and asked for advice. He gave it. The old Lon Chaney line, he counseled. Mystery man. We say nothing about him until the picture's released. After that, I have a hunch things will work out for themselves. The fellow is a marvel, so don't bother about stories until the film is canned. Consequently, I abandoned publicity efforts in Carl Jorla's direction. Now, I am very glad I did so, for there is no one to remember his name or suspect the horror that was soon to follow. 4. The script was finished. The front office approved. Stage 4 was under construction. The casting director got busy. Jorla was at the studio every day. Kincaid himself was teaching him English. The part was one in which very few words were needed, and Jorla proved a brilliant pupil, according to Les. But Les was not as pleased as he should have been about it all. He came to me one day about a week before production and unburdened himself. He strove to speak lightly about the affair, but I could tell that he felt worried. The gist of his story was very simple. Jorla was behaving strangely. He had had trouble with the front office. He refused to give the studio his living address, and it was known that he had checked out from his hotel several days after first arriving in Hollywood. Nor was that all. He wouldn't talk about his part or volunteer any information about interpretation. He seemed to be quite uninterested, admitting frankly to Kincaid that his only reason for signing a contract was to leave Europe. He told Kincaid what he had told me about the devil worshippers, and he hinted at more. He spoke of being followed, muttered about avengers and hunters who waited. He seemed to feel that the witch cult was angry at him for the violation of secrets, and held him responsible for the release of Return to the Sabbath. That, he explained, was why he would not give his address, nor speak of his past life for publication. That is why he must use very heavy makeup in his film debut here. He felt at times as though he were being watched or followed. There were many foreigners here. Too many. What the devil can I do with a man like that? Kincaid exploded after he had explained this to me. He's insane, or a fool, and I confess that he's too much like his screen character to please me. The damned casual way in which he professes to have dabbled in devil worship and sorcery. He believes all this, and, well, I'll tell you the truth. I came here today because of the last thing he spoke of to me this morning. He came down to the office. At first, when he walked in, I didn't know him. The dark glasses and muffler helped, of course, but he himself had changed. He was trembling and walked with a stoop, and when he spoke, his voice was like a groan. He showed me this. Kincaid handed me the clipping. It was from the London Times, through European press dispatches. A short paragraph giving an account of the death of Fritz Oman, the Austrian film director. He had been found strangled in a Paris garret, and his body had been frightfully mutilated. It mentioned an inverted cross branded on his stomach above the ripped entrails. Police were seeking the murderer. I handed the clipping back in silence. So what? I asked, but I had already guessed his answer. Fritz Oman, Kincaid said, slowly, was the director of the picture in which Carl Jorla played. The director, who with Jorla knew the devil worshippers. Jorla says that he fled to Paris and that they sought him out. I was silent. Mess, grunted Kincaid. I've offered Jorla police protection, and he's refused. I can't coerce him under the terms of our contract. As long as he plays the part, he's secure with us. But he has the jitters, and I'm getting them. He stormed out. I couldn't help him. I sat thinking of Carl Jorla, who believed in devil gods, worshipped, and betrayed them. And I could have smiled at the absurdity of it all if I hadn't seen the man on the screen and watched his evil eyes. He knew. It was then that I began to feel thankful we had not given Jorla any publicity. I had a hunch. During the next few days, I saw Jorla but seldom. The rumors however, began to trickle in. There had been an influx of foreign sightseers at the studio gates. Someone had attempted to crash through the barriers in a racing car. An extra, in a mob scene over on Lot 6, had been found carrying an automatic beneath his vest. When apprehended, he had been lurking under the executive office windows. They had taken him down to headquarters, and so far the man had refused to talk. He was a German. Jola came to the studios every day in a shuttered car. He was bundled up to the eyes. He trembled constantly. His English lessons went badly. He spoke to no one. He had hired 2 men to ride with him in his car. They were armed. A few days later, news came that the German extra had talked. He was evidently a pathological case. He babbled wildly of a black cult of Lucifer, known to some of the foreigners around town. It was a secret society purporting to worship the devil, with vague connections in the mother countries. He had been chosen to avenge a wrong. More than that he dared not say, but he did give an address where the police might find cult headquarters. The place, a dingy house in Glendale, was quite deserted, of course. It was a queer old house, with a secret cellar beneath the basement, but everything seemed to have been abandoned. The man was being held for examination by an alienist. I heard this report with deep misgivings. I knew something of Los Angeles' and Hollywood's heterogeneous foreign population. God knows, Southern California has attracted mystics and occultists from all over the world. I've even heard rumors about stars being mixed up in unsavory secret societies, things one would never dare to admit in print, and Jola was afraid. That afternoon, I tried to trail his black car as it left the studio for his mysterious home, but I lost the track in the winding reaches of Topanga Canyon. It had disappeared into the secret twilight of the Purple Hills, and I knew then that there was nothing I could do. Jola had his own defenses, and if they failed, we at the studio could not help. That was the evening he disappeared. At least, he did not show up the next morning at the studio, and production was to start in 2 days. We heard about it. The boss and Kincaid were frantic. The police were called in, and I did my best to hush things up. When Jola did not appear the following morning, I went to Kincaid and told him about my following the car to Topanga Canyon. The police went to work. Next morning was production. We spent a sleepless night of fruitless vigil. There was no word. Morning came, and there was unspoken dread in Kincaid's eyes as he faced me across the office table. 8 o'clock. We got up and walked silently across the lot to the studio cafeteria. Black coffee was badly needed. We hadn't had a police report for hours. We passed stage 4, where the Jola crew was at work. The noise of hammers was mockery. Jola, we felt, would never face a camera today, if ever. Bleskind, the director of the untitled horror opus, came out of the stage office as we passed. His paunchy body quivered as he grasped Kincaid's lapels and piped, "Any news?" Kincaid shook his head slowly. Bleskind thrust a cigar into his tense mouth. "We're shooting ahead," he snapped. "We'll shoot around Jola. If he doesn't show up when we finish the scenes in which he won't appear, we'll get another actor. But we can't wait." The squat director bustled back to the stage. Moved by a sudden impulse, Kincaid grasped my arm and propelled me after Bleskind's waddling form. "Let's see the opening shots," he suggested. "I want to see what kind of story they've given him." We entered stage 4. A Gothic castle, the ancestral home of Baron Ulmo. A dark, gloomy stone crypt of spidery horror, cobwebbed, dust-shrouded, deserted by men and given over to the rats by day and the unearthly horrors that crept by night. An altar stood by the crypt, an altar of evil, the great black stone on which the ancient Baron Ulmo and his devil cult had held their sacrifices. Now, in the pit beneath the altar, the Baron lay buried. Such was the legend. According to the first shot scheduled, Sivia Channing, the heroine, was exploring the castle. She had inherited the place and taken it over with her young husband. In this scene, she was to see the altar for the first time, read the inscription on its base. This inscription was to prove an unwitting invocation, opening up the crypt beneath the altar and awakening Jawler as Baron Almo from the dead. He was to rise from the crypt then and walk. It was at this point that the scene would terminate due to Jawler's strange absence. The setting was magnificently handled. Kincaid and I took our places beside Director Bleskind as the shot opened. Sylvia Channing walked out on the set, the signals were given, lights flashed, and the action began. It was pantomimic. Sylvia walked across the cobwebbed floor, noticed the altar, examined it. She stooped to read the inscription, then whispered it aloud. There was a drone as the opening of the altar crypt was mechanically begun. The altar swung aside, and the black, gaping pit was revealed. The upper cameras swung to Sylvia's face. She was to stare at the crypt in horror, and she did it most magnificently. In the picture, she would be watching Jawler emerge. Bleskind prepared to give the signal to cut action. Then, something emerged from the crypt. It was dead, that thing, that horror with a mask of faceless flesh. Its lean body was clothed in rotting rags, and on its chest was a bloody crucifix, inverted, carved out of dead flesh. The eyes blazed loathsomely. It was Baron Almo, rising from the dead, and it was Carl Jawler. The makeup was perfect. His eyes were dead, just as in the other film. The lips seemed shredded again, the mouth even more ghastly in its slitted blackness, and the touch of the bloody crucifix was immense. Bleskind nearly swallowed his cigar when Jawler appeared. Quickly he controlled himself, silently signaled the men to proceed with the shooting. We strained forward, watching every move, but Les Kincaid's eyes held a wonder akin to my own. Jawler was acting as never before. He moved slowly, as a corpse must move. As he raised himself from the crypt, each tiny effort seemed to cause him utter agony. The scene was soundless. Sylvia had fainted. But Jawler's lips moved, and we heard a faint whispering murmur which heightened the horror. Now the grisly cadaver was almost half out of the crypt. It strained upward, still murmuring. The bloody crucifix of flesh gleamed redly on the chest. I thought of the one found on the body of the murdered foreign director, Fritz Oman, and realized where Jawler had gotten the idea. The corpse strained up. It was to rise now, up, and then, with a sudden rictus, the body stiffened and slid back into the crypt. Who screamed first, I do not know, but the screaming continued after the prop boys had rushed to the crypt and looked down at what lay within. When I reached the brink of the pit, I screamed too, for it was utterly empty. 5. I wish there were nothing more to tell. The papers never knew. The police hushed things up. The studio was silent, and the production was dropped immediately. But matters did not stop there. There was a sequel to that hideous horror on stage 4. Kincaid and I cornered Bleskind. There was no need of any explanation. How could what we had just seen be explained in any sane way? Jawler had disappeared. No one had let him into the studio. No makeup man had given him his attention. Nobody had seen him enter the crypt. He had appeared in the scene, then disappeared. The crypt was empty. These were the facts. Kincaid told Bleskind what to do. The film was developed immediately, though 2 of the technicians fainted. We 3 sat in the projection booth and watched the morning's rushes flicker across the screen. The soundtrack was specially dubbed in. That scene, Sylvia walking and reading the incantation, the pit opening, and God, when nothing emerged. Nothing but that great red scar suspended in mid-air, that great inverted crucifix cut into bleeding flesh, no Jawler visible at all, that bleeding cross in the air, and then the mumbling. Jawler, the thing, whatever it was, had mumbled a few syllables on emerging from the crypt. The soundtrack had picked them up, and we couldn't see anything but that scar, yet we heard Jawler's voice now coming from nothingness. We heard what he kept repeating as he fell back into the crypt. It was an address in Topanga Canyon. The lights flickered on, and it was good to see them. Kincaid phoned the police and directed them to the address given on the soundtrack. We waited, the 3 of us, in Kincaid's office, waiting for the police call. We drank, but did not speak. Each of us was thinking of Carl Jola, the devil-worshipper, who had betrayed his faith, of his fear of vengeance. We thought of the director's death and the bloody crucifix on his chest, remembered Jola's disappearance, and then that ghastly ghost thing on the screen, the bloody thing that hung in mid-air as Jola's voice groaned the address. The phone rang. I picked it up. It was the police department. They gave their report. I fainted. It was several minutes before I came to. It was several more minutes before I opened my mouth and spoke. They found Carl Jola's body at the address given on the screen. I whispered. He was lying dead in an old shack up in the hills. He had been murdered. There was a bloody cross inverted on his chest. They think it was the work of some fanatics, because the place was filled with books on sorcery and black magic. They say... I paused. Kincaid's eyes commanded, "Go on." "They say," I murmured, "that Jola had been dead for at least 3 days." The Man on the Ground by Robert E. Howard. Cal Reynolds shifted his tobacco quid to the other side of his mouth as he squinted down the dull blue barrel of his Winchester. His jaws worked methodically, their movements ceasing as he found his bead. He froze into rigid immobility, then his finger hooked on the trigger. The crack of the shot sent the echoes rattling among the hills, and like a louder echo came an answering shot. Reynolds flinched down, flattening his rangy body against the earth, swearing softly. A gray flake jumped from one of the rocks near his head, the ricocheting bullet whining off into space. Reynolds involuntarily shivered. The sound was as deadly as the singing of an unseen rattler. He raised himself gingerly, high enough to peer out between the rocks in front of him. Separated from his refuge by a broad level grown from mesquite grass and prickly pear, rose a tangle of boulders similar to that behind which he crouched. From among these boulders floated a thin wisp of whitish smoke. Reynolds's keen eyes, trained to sun-scorched distances, detected a small circle of dully gleaming blue steel among the rocks. That ring was the muzzle of a rifle, but Reynolds well knew who lay behind that muzzle. The feud between Cal Reynolds and Esau Brill had been long for a Texas feud. Up in the Kentucky mountains, family wars may straggle on for generations, but the geographical conditions and human temperament of the Southwest were not conducive to long drawn-out hostilities. Their feuds were generally concluded with appalling suddenness and finality. The stage was a saloon, the streets of a little cowtown, or the open range. Sniping from the laurel was exchanged for the close-range thundering of six-shooters and sawed-off shotguns, which decided matters quickly, one way or the other. The case of Cal Reynolds and Esau Brill was somewhat out of the ordinary. In the first place, the feud concerned only themselves. Neither friends nor relatives were drawn into it. No one, including the participants, knew just how it started. Cal Reynolds merely knew that he had hated Esau Brill most of his life, and that Brill reciprocated. Once as youths, they had clashed with the violence and intensity of rival young catamounts. From that encounter, Reynolds carried away a knife scar across the edge of his ribs, and Brill a permanently impaired eye. It had decided nothing. They had fought to a bloody, gasping deadlock, and neither had felt any desire to shake hands and make up. That is a hypocrisy developed in civilization, where men have no stomach for fighting to the death. After a man has felt his adversary's knife grate against his bones, his adversary's thumb gouging at his eyes, his adversary's boot heels stamped into his mouth, he is scarcely inclined to forgive and forget, regardless of the original merits of the argument. So, Reynolds and Brill carried their mutual hatred into manhood, and as cowpunchers riding for rival ranches, it followed that they found opportunities to carry on their private war. Reynolds rustled cattle from Brill's boss, and Brill returned the compliment. Each raged at the other's tactics, and considered himself justified in eliminating his enemy in any way that he could. Brill caught Reynolds without his gun one night in a saloon at Cowell's, and only an ignominious flight out of the back way, with bullets barking at his heels, saved the Reynolds scalp. Again, Reynolds, lying in the chaparral, neatly knocked his enemy out of his saddle at 500 yards with a 30-30 slug, and, but for the inopportune appearance of a line rider, the feud would have ended there, Reynolds deciding, in the face of this witness, to forego his original intention of leaving his covert and hammering out the wounded man's brains with his rifle butt. Brill recovered from his wound, having the vitality of a longhorn bull, in common with all his sun-leathered iron-thewed breed, and as soon as he was on his feet, he came gunning for the man who had waylaid him. Now, after these onsets and skirmishes, the enemies faced each other at good rifle range, among the lonely hills where interruption was unlikely. For more than an hour they had lain among the rocks, shooting at each hint of movement. Neither had scored a hit, though the 30-30s whistled perilously close. In each of Reynolds' temples, a tiny pulse hammered, maddeningly. The sun beat down on him, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. Gnats swarmed about his head, getting into his eyes, and he cursed venomously. His wet hair was plastered to his scalp, his eyes burned with the glare of the sun, and the rifle barrel was hot to his calloused hand. His right leg was growing numb, and he shifted it cautiously, cursing at the jingle of the spur, though he knew Brill could not hear. All this discomfort added fuel to the fire of his wrath. Without process of conscious reasoning, he attributed all his suffering to his enemy. The sun beat dazingly on his sombrero, and his thoughts were slightly addled. It was hotter than the hearthstone of hell among those bare rocks. His dry tongue caressed his baked lips. Through the muddle of his brain burned his hatred of Esau Brill. It had become more than an emotion. It was an obsession, a monstrous incubus. When he flinched from the whip-crack of Brill's rifle, it was not from fear of death, but because the thought of dying at the hands of his foe was an intolerable horror that made his brain rock with red frenzy. He would have thrown his life away recklessly, if by so doing he could have sent Brill into eternity just 3 seconds ahead of himself. He did not analyze these feelings. Men who live by their hands have little time for self-analysis. He was no more aware of the quality of his hate for Esau Brill than he was consciously aware of his hands and feet. It was part of him, and more than part. It enveloped him, engulfed him. His mind and body were no more than its material manifestations. He was the hate. It was the whole soul and spirit of him. Unhampered by the stagnant and enervating shackles of sophistication and intellectuality, his instincts rose sheer from the naked primitive, and from them crystallized an almost tangible abstraction, a hate too strong for even death to destroy, a hate powerful enough to embody itself in itself, without the aid or the necessity of material substance. For perhaps a quarter of an hour, neither rifle had spoken. Instinct with death, as rattlesnakes coiled among the rocks soaking up poison from the sun's rays, the feudists lay, each waiting his chance, playing the game of endurance until the taut nerves of one or the other should snap. It was Esau Brill who broke, not that his collapse took the form of any wild madness or nervous explosion. The wary instincts of the wild were too strong in him for that. But suddenly, with a screamed curse, he hitched up on his elbow and fired blindly at the tangle of stones which concealed his enemy. Only the upper part of his arm and the corner of his blue-shirted shoulder were for an instant visible. That was enough. In that flash second, Cal Reynolds jerked the trigger, and a frightful yell told him his bullet had found its mark. And at the animal pain in that yell, reason and lifelong instincts were swept away by an insane flood of terrible joy. He did not whoop exultantly and spring to his feet, but his teeth bared in a wolfish grin, and he involuntarily raised his head. Waking instinct jerked him down again. It was chance that undid him. Even as he ducked back, Brill's answering shot cracked. Cal Reynolds did not hear it because, simultaneously with the sound, something exploded in his skull, plunging him into utter blackness, shot briefly with red sparks. The blackness was only momentary. Cal Reynolds glared wildly around, realizing with a frenzied shock that he was lying in the open. The impact of the shot had sent him rolling from among the rocks, and in that quick instant, he realized that it had not been a direct hit. Chance had sent the bullet glancing from a stone, apparently to flick his scalp in passing. That was not so important. What was important was that he was lying out in full view, where Esau Brill could fill him full of lead. A wild glance showed his rifle lying close by. It had fallen across a stone and lay with the stock against the ground, the barrel slanting upward. Another glance showed his enemy standing upright among the stones that had concealed him. In that one glance, Cal Reynolds took in the details of the tall, rangy figure, the stained trousers sagging with the weight of the holstered six-shooter, the legs tucked into the worn leather boots, the streak of crimson on the shoulder of the blue shirt, which was plastered to the wearer's body with sweat, the tousled black hair, from which perspiration was pouring down the unshaven face. He caught the glint of yellow tobacco-stained teeth shining in a savage grin. Smoke still drifted from the rifle in Brill's hands. These familiar and hated details stood out in startling clarity during the fleeting instant while Reynolds struggled madly against the unseen chains which seemed to hold him to the earth. Even as he thought of the paralysis a glancing blow on the head might induce, something seemed to snap, and he rolled free. Rolled is hardly the word. He seemed almost to dart to the rifle that lay across the rock, so light his limbs felt. Dropping behind the stone, he seized the weapon. He didn't even have to lift it. As it lay, it bore directly on the man who was now approaching. His hand was momentarily halted by Esau Brill's strange behavior. Instead of firing or leaping back into cover, the man came straight on, his rifle in the crook of his arm, that damnable leer still on his unshaven lips. Was he mad? Could he not see that his enemy was up again, raging with life, and with a cocked rifle at his heart? Brill seemed not to be looking at him, but to one side, at the spot where Reynolds had just been lying. Without seeking further for the explanation of his foe's actions, Cal Reynolds pulled the trigger. With the vicious spang of the report, a blue shred leaped from Brill's broad breast. He staggered back, his mouth flying open, and the look on his face froze Reynolds again. Esau Brill came of a breed which fights to its last gasp. Nothing was more certain than that he would go down pulling the trigger blindly until the last red vestige of life left him. Yet the ferocious triumph was wiped from his face with the crack of the shot, to be replaced by an awful expression of dazed surprise. He made no move to lift his rifle, which slipped from his grasp, nor did he clutch at his wound. Throwing out his hands in a strange, stunned, helpless way, he reeled backward on slowly buckling legs, his features frozen into a mask of stupid amazement that made his watcher shiver with its cosmic horror. Through the opened lips gushed a tide of blood, dyeing the damp shirt, and like a tree that sways and rushes suddenly earthward, Esau Brill crashed down among the mesquite grass and lay motionless. Cal Reynolds rose, leaving the rifle where it lay. The rolling grass-grown hills swam misty and indistinct to his gaze. Even the sky and the blazing sun had a hazy, unreal aspect. But a savage content was in his soul. The long feud was over at last, and whether he had taken his death wound or not, he had sent Esau Brill to blaze the trail to hell ahead of him. Then he started violently, as his gaze wandered to the spot where he had rolled after being hit. He glared. Were his eyes playing him tricks? Yonder in the grass, Esau Brill lay dead, yet only a few feet away stretched another body. Rigid with surprise, Reynolds glared at the rangy figure slumped grotesquely beside the rocks. It lay partly on its side, as if flung there by some blind convulsion, the arms outstretched, the fingers crooked as if blindly clutching. The short-cropped sandy hair was splashed with blood, and from a ghastly hole in the temple the brains were oozing. From a corner of the mouth seeped a thin trickle of tobacco juice to stain the dusty neckcloth. and as he gazed, an awful familiarity made itself evident. He knew the feel of those shiny leather wristbands. He knew with fearful certainty whose hands had buckled that gun belt. The tang of that tobacco juice was still on his palate. In one brief, destroying instant, he knew he was looking down at his own lifeless body, and with the knowledge came true oblivion. The Mandrakes, by Clark Ashton Smith. Gill Grenier, the sorcerer, and his wife Sabine, coming into Lower Averoigne from parts unknown or at least unverified, had selected the location of their hut with a careful forethought. The hut was close to those marshes through which the slackening waters of the River Iswal, after leaving the great forest, had overflowed in sluggish, reed-clogged channels and sedge-hidden pools mantled with scum like witches' oils. It stood among osiers and alders on a low, mound-shaped elevation, and in front, toward the marshes, there was a loamy meadow bottom, where the short fat stems and tufted leaves of the mandrake grew in lush abundance, being more plentiful and of greater size than elsewhere through all that sorcery-ridden province. The fleshy, bifurcated roots of this plant, held by many to resemble the human body, were used by Gill and Sabine in the brewing of love philters. Their potions, being compounded with much care and cunning, soon acquired a marvellous renown among the peasants and villagers, and were even in request among people of a loftier station, who came privily to the wizard's hut. They would rouse, people said, a kindly warmth in the coldest and most prudent bosom, would melt the armour of the most obdurate virtue. As a result, the demand for these sovereign magistrals became enormous. The couple dealt also in other drugs and simples, in charms and divination, and Gill, according to common belief, could read infallibly the dictates of the stars. Oddly enough, considering the temper of the 15th century, when magic and witchcraft were still so widely reprobated, he and his wife enjoyed a repute by no means ill or unsavoury. No charges of malefice were brought against them, and because of the number of honest marriages promoted by the philters, the local clergy were content to disregard the many illicit amours that had come to a successful issue through the same agency. It is true, there were those who looked askance at Gill in the beginning, and who whispered fearfully that he had been driven out of Blois, where all persons bearing the name Grenier were popularly believed to be werewolves. They called attention to the excessive hairiness of the wizard, whose hands were black with bristles and whose beard grew almost to his eyes. Such insinuations, however, were generally considered as lacking proof, insomuch as no other signs or marks of lycanthropy were ever displayed by Gill. And in time, for reasons that have been sufficiently indicated, the few detractors of Gill were wholly overborne by a secret but widespread sentiment of public favour. Even by their patrons, very little was known regarding the strange couple, who maintained the reserve proper to those who dealt in mystery and enchantment. Sabine, a comely woman with blue-grey eyes and wheat-coloured hair, and no trace of the traditional witch in her appearance, was obviously much younger than Gill, whose sable mane and beard were already touched with the white warp of time. It was rumoured by visitors that she had oftentimes been overheard in sharp dispute with her husband, and people soon made a jest of this, remarking that the philters might well be put to a domestic use by those who purveyed them. But aside from such rumours and ribaldries, little was thought of the matter. The connubial infelicities of Gill and his wife, whether grave or trivial, in no wise impaired the renown of their love potions. Also, little was thought of Sabine's absence when, 5 years after the coming of the pair into Averoigne, it became remarked by neighbours and customers that Gill was alone. In reply to queries, the sorcerer merely said that his spouse had departed on a long journey to visit relatives in a remote province. The explanation was accepted without debate, and it did not occur to anyone that there had been no eyewitnesses of Sabine's departure. It was then mid-autumn, and Gill told the inquirers in a somewhat vague and indirect fashion that his wife would not return before spring. Winter came early that year, and tarried late with deeply crusted snows in the forest and on the uplands, and a heavy armor of fretted ice on the marshes. It was a winter of much hardship and privation. When the tardy spring had broken the silver buds of the willows and had covered the alders with a foliage of chrysolite, few thought to ask Gill regarding Sabine's return. And later, when the purple bells of the mandrake were succeeded by small orange-coloured apples, her prolonged absence was taken for granted. Gill, living tranquilly with his books and cauldrons, and gathering the roots and herbs for his magical medicaments, was well enough pleased to have it taken for granted. He did not believe that Sabine would ever return, and his unbelief, it would seem, was far from irrational. He had killed her one eve in autumn, during a dispute of unbearable acrimony, slitting her soft, pale throat in self-defence with a knife, which he had wrested from her fingers when she lifted it against him. Afterward, he had buried her by the late rays of a gibbous moon, beneath the mandrakes in the meadow bottom, replacing the leafy sods with much care, so that there was no evidence of their having been disturbed other than by the digging of a few roots in the way of daily business. After the melting of the long snows from the meadow, he himself could scarcely have been altogether sure of the spot in which he had interred her body. He noticed, however, as the season drew on, that there was a place where the mandrakes grew with even more than their wonted exuberance, and this place, he believed, was the very site of her grave. Visiting it often, he smiled with a secret irony, and was pleased, rather than troubled, by the thought of that charnel nourishment which might have contributed to the lushness of the dark, glossy leaves. In fact, it may well have been a similar irony that had led him to choose the Mandrake Meadow as a place of burial for the murdered witch-wife. Gilles Grenier was not sorry that he had killed Sabine. They had been ill-mated from the beginning, and the woman had shown toward him in their quotidian quarrels the venomous spitefulness of a very hell-cat. He had not loved the vixen, and it was far pleasanter to be alone, with his somewhat sombre temper unruffled by her acrid speeches, and his sallow face and grizzling beard uptorn by her sharp fingernails. With the renewal of spring, as the sorcerer had expected, there was much demand for his love-philters among the smitten swains and lasses of the neighbourhood. There came to him, also, the gallants who sought to overcome a stubborn chastity, and the wives who wished to recall a wandering fancy or allure the forbidden desires of young men. Anon, it became necessary for Gill to replenish his stock of mandrake potions, and with this purpose in mind, he went forth at midnight beneath the full May moon to dig the newly grown roots from which he would brew his amatory enchantments. Smiling darkly beneath his beard, he began to cull the great moon-pale plants which flourished on Sabine's grave, digging out the homunculus-like taproots very carefully with a curious trowel made from the femur of a witch. Though he was well used to the weird and often vaguely human forms assumed by the mandrake, Gill was somewhat surprised by the appearance of the first root. It seemed inordinately large, unnaturally white, and, eyeing it more closely, he saw that it bore the exact likeness of a woman's body and lower limbs, being cloven to the middle and clearly formed even to the 10 toes. There were no arms, however, and the bosom ended in the large tuft of ovate leaves. Gill was more than startled by the fashion in which the root seemed to turn and writhe when he lifted it from the ground. He dropped it hastily, and the minikin limbs lay quivering on the grass. But after a little reflection, he took the prodigy as a possible mark of satanic favour, and continued his digging. To his amazement, the next root was formed in much the same manner as the first. A half-dozen more, which he proceeded to dig, were shaped in miniature mockery of a woman from breasts to heels, and amid the superstitious awe and wonder with which he regarded them, he became aware of their singularly intimate resemblance to Sabine. At this discovery, Gill was deeply perturbed, for the thing was beyond his comprehension. The miracle, whether divine or demoniac, began to assume a sinister and doubtful aspect. It was as if the slain woman herself had returned, or had somehow wrought her unholy simulacrum in the mandrakes. His hand trembled as he started to dig up another plant, and working with less than his usual care, he failed to remove the whole of the bifurcated root, cutting into it clumsily with a trowel of sharp bone. He saw that he had severed one of the tiny ankles. At the same instant, a shrill, reproachful cry, like the voice of Sabine herself in mingled pain and anger, seemed to pierce his ears with intolerable acuity, though the volume was strangely lessened, as if the voice had come from a distance. The cry ceased, and was not repeated. Gill, sorely terrified, found himself staring at the trowel, on which there was a dark, blood-like stain. Trembling, he pulled out the severed root, and saw that it was dripping with a sanguine fluid. At first, in his dark fear and half-guilty apprehension, he thought of burying the roots, which lay palely before him with their eldritch and obscene similitude to the dead sorceress. He would hide them deeply from his own sight and the ken of others, lest the murder he had done should somehow be suspected. Presently, however, his alarm began to lessen. It occurred to him that, even if seen by others, the roots would be looked upon merely as a freak of nature, and would in no manner serve to betray his crime, since their actual resemblance to the person of Sabine was a thing which none but he could rightfully know. Also, he thought, the roots might well possess an extraordinary virtue, and from them, perhaps, he would brew philters of never-equalled power and efficacy. Overcoming entirely his initial dread and repulsion, he filled a small osier basket with the quivering, leaf-headed figurines. Then he went back to his hut, seeing in the bizarre phenomenon merely the curious advantage to which it might be turned, and wholly oblivious to any darker meaning, such as might have been read by others in his place. In his callous hardihood, he was not disquieted overmuch by the profuse bleeding of a sanguine matter from the mandrakes when he came to prepare them for his cauldron. The ungodly, furious hissing, the mad foaming and boiling of the brew, like a devil's broth, he ascribed to the unique potency of its ingredients. He even dared to choose the most shapely and perfect of the woman-like plants, and hung it up in his hut amid other roots and dried herbs and simples, intending to consult it as an oracle in future, according to the custom of wizards. The new philters which he had concocted were bought by eager customers, and Gill ventured to recommend them for their surpassing virtue, which would kindle amorous warmth in a bosom of marble or inflame the very dead. Now, in the old legend of Averoigne which I recount herewith, it is told that the impious and audacious wizard, fearing neither god nor devil nor witch-woman, dared to dig again in the earth of Sabine's grave, removing many more of the white, female-shapen roots, which cried aloud in shrill complaint to the waning moon or turned like living limbs at his violence. And all those which he dug were formed alike in the miniature image of the dead Sabine from breasts to toes, and from them, it is said, he compounded other philters, which he meant to sell in time when such should be requested. As it happened, however, these latter potions were never dispensed, and only a few of the first were sold, owing to the frightful and calamitous consequences that followed their use. For those to whom the potions had been administered privily, whether men or women, were not moved by the genial fury of desire, as was the wonted result, but were driven by a darker rage, by a woeful and satanic madness irresistibly impelling them to harm or even to slay the persons who had sought to attract their love. Husbands were turned against wives, lasses against their lovers, with speeches of bitter hate and scatheful deeds. A certain young gallant who had gone to the promised rendezvous was met by a vengeful madwoman who tore his face into bleeding shreds with her nails. A mistress who had thought to win back her recreant knight was mistreated foully and done to death by him who had hitherto been impeccably gentle, even if faithless. The scandal of these untoward happenings was such as would attend an invasion of demons. The crazed men and women, it was thought at first, were veritably possessed by devils, but when the use of the potions became rumoured, and their provenance was clearly established, the burden of the blame fell upon Gilles Grenier, who, by the law of both church and state, was now charged with sorcery. The constables who went to arrest Gill found him at evening in his hut of raddled osiers, stooping and muttering above a cauldron that foamed and hissed and boiled as if it had been filled with the spate of phlegethon. They entered and took him unaware. He submitted calmly, but expressed surprise when told of the lamentable effect of the love philters, and he neither affirmed nor denied the charge of wizardry. As they were about to leave with their prisoner, the officers heard a shrill, tiny, shrewish voice that cried from the shadows of the hut, where bunches of dried simples and other sorcerous ingredients were hanging. It appeared to issue from a strange, half-withered root cloven in the very likeness of a woman's body and legs, a root that was partly pale and partly black with cauldron smoke. One of the constables thought that he recognized the voice as being that of Sabine, the sorcerer's wife. All swore that they heard the voice clearly and were able to distinguish these words: "Dig deeply in the meadow, where the mandrakes grow the thickliest." The officers were sorely frightened, both by this uncanny voice and the obscene likeness of the root, which they regarded as a work of Satan. Also, there was much doubt anent the wisdom of obeying the oracular injunction. Gill, who was questioned narrowly as to its meaning, refused to offer any interpretation, but certain marks of perturbation in his manner finally led the officers to examine the mandrake meadow below the hut. Digging by lantern light in the specified spot, they found many more of the enchanted roots, which seemed to crowd the ground, and beneath they came to the rotting corpse of a woman, which was still recognizable as that of Sabine. As a result of this discovery, Gilles Grenier was arraigned not only for sorcery, but also for the murder of his wife. He was readily convicted of both crimes, though he denied stoutly the imputation of intentional malefice, and claimed to the very last that he had killed Sabine only in defense of his own life against a termagant fury. He was hanged on the gibbet in company with other murderers, and his dead body was then burned at the stake. Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to support our work here at HorrorBabble, be sure to check out the video description below, where you'll find links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,